Hello there, and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity settles in slowly and science takes its time moving from one thought to the next. Tonight we'll drift into a question that stretches far beyond anything written in textbooks or carved into ancient stone. It's a question that rests quietly beneath every fossil, every grain of sand, and every forgotten ruin. What if the first civilization on Earth destroyed itself long before ours ever began? Not the earliest known empires, not the historical kingdoms or the stone monuments that fill museums and documentaries, but something even older. Something so far back that it predates myth, predates memory, and perhaps even predates what we think of as humanity as we know it. A civilization lost so deeply in time that its traces, if they existed, have been ground down into the planet itself. Before we wander too far into that idea, I'd like to know something simple, just between you and me in this quiet moment. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you somewhere tucked in your room, settling down after a long day, or maybe leaning back in your chair with the lights dimmed and the world finally slowing to a manageable pace? And what time is it there in your corner of the world? It's always interesting to think about how each of us arrives here at different moments, all listening to the same words but separated by hours, routines, and the timing of our own days. Somehow this gathering still feels like a shared space, one where curiosity is allowed to take its time. If you find this kind of gentle exploration comforting, or if you simply enjoy drifting through these slow and steady scientific stories, I'd be grateful if you gave the video a like or subscribed. It helps this little calming corner reach someone else who might need it. Now that we've settled in, let's ease our way into the idea that somewhere in the very distant past, a civilization could have risen, flourished, and fallen long before the first recognizable chapter of human history began. When people think about ancient civilizations, they often imagine the familiar images from school lessons or documentaries: pyramids under bright desert skies, carved stone temples, terraced fields, ships shaped from timber. They picture the early cities of Mesopotamia, the river valleys of the Nile, the yellowed ruins of Greece or Rome. These are impressive achievements, and in the story of our species they feel foundational. But all of these cultures existed within a relatively small slice of time. They are recent when compared to the full age of the planet. The Earth itself is more than 4 billion years old, yet civilization as we officially chart it appears only in the final few thousand. It's like reading a book and discovering that almost all the pages are blank except for a short ending chapter. Everything before that is silent, or at least hidden in language we haven't learned to decipher. That enormous silence leaves room for questions. Not because we want to replace science with speculation, but because the scale of time on Earth invites ideas that sit just beyond what we can confirm. When we investigate human prehistory, we rely on fragile clues: burned seeds, stone tools, cave paintings, fragments of bones. The deeper we dig, the fewer traces we find, and the more we realize how easy it is for evidence to fade. If a civilization existed long before our recorded past, the Earth would have had millions of years to erase almost every sign of it. And that thought alone opens up a vast space to explore. Imagine, for instance, that a group of early humans or human-like ancestors formed a society far more advanced than we typically imagine for those time periods. Something more organized, more structured, something with systems, patterns, and tools that could have grown generation after generation. This wouldn't require futuristic machines or modern electronics. A civilization doesn't need to resemble ours to be complex. It could be defined by cooperation, by knowledge passed between groups, by a network of settlements that work together. It could be something that expanded across regions in ways that didn't leave behind skyscrapers or metal towers, but perhaps left behind stories or traditions that eventually dissolved into the environment long before any of the civilizations we study today began to form. Yet the question that lingers beneath all of this is not just whether such an early civilization existed. It's whether it might have ended because of itself, whether it could have shaped its own downfall through choices, pressures, or conflicts that spiraled beyond its ability to control. Human behaviour, in all ages, emerges from instincts, from needs, from pressures placed on groups, and from challenges that rise out of the environment. If early humans learned to manipulate resources, lived in larger groups and developed strategies to survive together, they might also have faced problems that resemble the issues we deal with today. Scarcity, conflict, environmental strain, and the difficulty of balancing growth with stability. As we move through this idea, it helps to remember that civilizations do not need advanced metalwork or elaborate structures to be vulnerable to collapse. They can be fragile simply because they depend on relationships between people and the land they rely on. If a society expanded too quickly, strained its resources, or faced internal divisions, it might have encountered problems that slowly chipped away at its foundation. Over time, those pressures could have led to a collapse significant enough to cause the entire structure of that early civilization to dissolve. Not overnight, not dramatically, but gradually and steadily until the people who once formed that society scattered or diminished, leaving behind very little for us to uncover. The Earth is efficient when it comes to recycling its surface. Wind, water, ice, tectonics, and time all work together to break down evidence. Wood decays, clay erodes, bone fragments crumble, even stone can be weathered to grains. In just a few thousand years, an abandoned settlement can vanish into the landscape. In a few million, entire continents shift, coastlines change, and mountains rise or fall. Over tens of millions of years, the geological record becomes a blend of pressure, heat, and layered minerals where anything small or delicate simply disappears. And if a civilization existed tens or hundreds of thousands of years before what we recognize as early human societies, the traces we would expect to find today might not resemble anything we know how to identify. Exploring this idea doesn't require assuming that a forgotten civilization had machines or global technology. The concept is less about imagining a science fiction scenario and more about recognizing how little we truly know about the earliest chapters of human presence on Earth. There are gaps in the timeline where we simply do not have complete evidence. Those gaps don't prove anything specific, but they remind us of the limitations of our understanding. They remind us that silence in the archaeological record can come from absence, but it can also come from erosion, destruction, or forms of evidence that degrade too quickly to survive deep time. When researchers study early human development, they often emphasize how difficult it is to draw firm conclusions from limited remains. A single bone or tool fragment can shift entire timelines. A newly discovered cave site can rewrite ideas about migration, population size, or behavior. If new evidence can reshape our understanding of events from tens of thousands of years ago, imagine how little we might know about events from hundreds of thousands or even millions of years earlier. This uncertainty is not a flaw in science. It's simply the nature of working with a planet that is constantly reshaping itself. Thinking about a civilization lost that far back in time invites us to consider what forms of organization could have existed. Perhaps they built with organic materials. Maybe they constructed shelters from wood, woven fibers, or animal hides. These materials would vanish quickly when exposed to weather. Even if they used simple baked clay or stone tools, these could break down or dissolve over immense stretches of time, especially if buried beneath layers of sediment or destroyed by natural forces. In these scenarios, the Earth becomes a constant eraser, smoothing out the past until all that remains is a general memory of early humans existing long before agriculture or writing emerged. But if a civilization did rise and fall that early, the question becomes how it might have destroyed itself. The idea is not meant to be dramatic or apocalyptic. It's simply an examination of what we know about societies that fail. Collapse is rarely a sudden event. Often it's a gradual process where pressures accumulate, internal conflict grows, cooperation weakens, resources become scarce, trade networks fade, leadership structures lose stability, people begin to separate into smaller groups. Over time, the unity that once defined a civilization dissolves, sometimes leaving little evidence behind. These processes could apply to societies at any scale. Thinking about an early civilization through this lens is less about imagining advanced technology and more about recognizing patterns that occur in all complex groups. Human beings, regardless of era, respond to their environment, to each other, and to the challenges they face. If early humans organized into a large society, they might have encountered challenges similar to those faced by later civilizations, even if the specific tools and systems were very different. The fragility of cooperation, the difficulty of managing resources, and the tensions created by growth could have played a role in a gradual decline. If we were to follow this idea further, we might imagine that after such a civilization fell, the scattered groups that remained slowly lost the shared knowledge that once held them together. People revert to simpler forms of living, not because they lack intelligence, but because maintaining complexity requires stability and communication. Over generations, skills can be forgotten, traditions can be abandoned, practices that once defined a society can disappear if they no longer fit the needs or circumstances of the remaining population. Eventually, the memory of the civilization fades completely, replaced by new patterns of life that bear little resemblance to what came before. All of this leads to a broader thought that we'll continue exploring. If a civilization long before our own did destroy itself, intentionally or accidentally, the Earth would have had an enormous amount of time to absorb everything it left behind. And that brings us to the quiet question that waits ahead, which is how we might recognize traces of something so old when almost everything we look for today depends on materials that break down with time. When people first learn about the earliest parts of human history, the story usually begins with familiar discoveries carved into timelines, tools chipped from stone, fireplace remnants, simple shelters, scattered bones. We picture small groups living close to the land, moving with the seasons, developing slowly over thousands of years. It feels distant, but still recognizable, as if we're tracing the first steps leading directly to everything we now understand as civilization. Yet once you start exploring the deeper layers of Earth's history, that neat progression becomes less certain. There are stretches of time so vast, so empty of clear evidence, that it becomes difficult to imagine we have the full picture. This silence can feel like a missing chapter that no one realized was gone. If you stand in any desert today and let your eyes follow the horizon, the earth beneath your feet has changed shape countless times. Entire ecosystems have come and gone, river channels have shifted, forests have grown, vanished and grown again. Continents have moved, mountain ranges have risen and collapsed. What looks permanent in the moment is, in the timeline of the planet, only temporary. That shifting foundation makes the idea of discovering anything older than a few tens of thousands of years incredibly challenging. The deeper you go in time, the more the past becomes a series of loose fragments instead of a continuous story. When archaeologists uncover the remains of an ancient city from 5,000 years ago, they're already working with something fragile. Walls crumble, artifacts break, text fades. But at least those remains sit within a time period that hasn't been completely reshaped by geological forces. Now consider the remains of anything that might have existed not thousands, but hundreds of thousands of years earlier. The ground itself might have folded, compacted, or fused under pressure. What was once a surface someone walked on might now be buried beneath layers of sediment, compressed rock, or volcanic material. The chances of finding direct evidence are extremely small, and even if fragments survived, they would likely be unrecognizable without context. This brings us to a simple but important point. When people imagine ancient civilizations, they often think of stone monuments, durable structures, or objects built to last. But civilizations don't always build in stone. Many groups throughout history constructed homes from wood, clay, woven plant fibers, or materials that degrade quickly. Even today, there are entire cultures whose architectural traditions leave behind almost nothing after a few centuries. If a society far earlier in human prehistory used materials like these, the traces would disappear rapidly. Wind, rain, temperature shifts, and microorganisms would break them down until even the faintest sign was gone. Once you recognize how fragile evidence can be, the possibility of losing an entire civilization no longer feels like fiction. It becomes a matter of scale and time. If the Sahara, for example, once held rivers and grasslands, and evidence of early human activity lies buried beneath those sands, then it's reasonable to imagine other regions of the world might hide similar secrets. Deserts cover what used to be lakes or forests. Forests grow over what used to be clear ground. Ice sheets expand and retreat, and entire landscapes shift beneath them. The Earth is constantly adjusting itself, and with every change it buries or destroys parts of its history. Some of the most interesting clues about early human behaviour come from small artefacts found in places where conditions allowed them to survive. A piece of stone shaped by human hands, a charred patch of soil that once held a fire, a fragment of pigment used for marking surfaces. These discoveries are meaningful, but they also highlight how little of the full picture has survived. For every artifact found, countless others were lost. For every preserved site, thousands more vanished without a trace. It's easy to forget that what we see today is only the portion the Earth allowed us to keep. Imagine, then, groups of early humans living in areas now covered by deserts, oceans, or dense jungle. If they settled near coastlines, many of those areas are now underwater due to changing sea levels. During ice ages, sea levels were far lower, exposing vast stretches of land that are now hidden beneath the ocean. Any structures or settlements built there would be inaccessible today without extensive underwater exploration. Even simple coastal communities, if they existed, could have left behind tools or materials that are now buried in sediment or eroded by the constant movement of water. Some researchers have considered whether unusual markings on ancient surfaces, odd patterns in geological layers, or unexpected scatterings of stone might hint at human activity earlier than currently accepted. Most of the time, these findings have natural explanations. Rock fractures from frozen water, marks left by animals, shifts caused by roots or soil movement. However, there are occasional discoveries that prompt deeper questions. They don't prove anything on their own, but they invite re-examination. The uncertainty isn't evidence of an early civilization, but it does show how easily early traces could be misinterpreted or overlooked. When you think about how early humans lived, you also have to consider how they travelled. If groups migrated over large areas, following food sources or seasonal patterns, they wouldn't have stayed long in a single place. Temporary camps leave fewer lasting traces than permanent settlements. Footprints vanish within days. Fire pits wash away in storms. Tools carried from place to place might break and be discarded in ways that blend into the landscape. If these groups interacted, traded, or shared knowledge, those networks wouldn't necessarily leave behind physical evidence. Ideas can spread without leaving a single artifact behind. The concept of a forgotten civilization doesn't require imagining something highly advanced. All it requires is the possibility that humans or their close relatives were more organized earlier than we typically assume. For much of human evolution, different species of early humans overlapped. Some had larger brains, some had more sophisticated tools, and some lived in complex social groups. If one of these groups developed stable communities, shared labour, or even rudimentary systems for managing resources, they could form something that fits the basic definition of a civilization, and they could lose it just as easily. Consider how knowledge was transmitted long before writing. Everything depended on memory, teaching, and oral traditions. If a population shrank or scattered, knowledge could disappear within a few generations. If environmental changes forced groups to move or adapt rapidly, specialized skills could be forgotten. When we look at the long arc of human history, we sometimes assume progress is inevitable, but progress depends on stability, communication, and shared purpose. Remove any of those elements, and societies can regress to simpler forms, not out of lack of ability, but because circumstances demand it. There's another factor that influences what we can find today. The materials used by early societies might not resemble the tools we expect. Even in relatively recent history, groups around the world developed technologies adapted to their environments. Tools made from bone, antler, shell, or plant fibers were common. These materials degrade quickly, leaving behind little more than faint impressions or tiny fragments. If a civilization relied heavily on natural materials, its entire technological system could vanish from the archaeological record. Environmental shifts also play a significant role in erasing the past. Floods can sweep away entire settlements. Earthquakes can bury regions under debris. Volcanic eruptions can cover large areas with ash and lava, preserving some things while completely destroying others. Over tens of thousands of years, these events accumulate. A site might be destroyed once, then the remains destroyed again by later changes, until the original structures are impossible to identify. The deeper the time period, the more likely this process has occurred many times over. Even something as simple as plant growth can erase evidence. Roots grow into cracks in stone, breaking it apart. Plants cover abandoned areas, hiding signs beneath layers of soil. Animals dig, burrow, and move materials in ways that disrupt patterns. Insects consume organic remains. Microbial activity breaks down wood, bone, and fibers. When you consider all these processes together, it becomes clear why the earliest parts of human activity are so difficult to reconstruct. If you walk across a modern city and imagine what it would look like after 200,000 years without human maintenance, the answer is almost always the same. It wouldn't look like a city anymore. Buildings would collapse, streets would be overtaken by vegetation, metal structures would decay, concrete would crumble, insects, water and temperature changes would break down the remaining materials. Eventually, only a few geological traces might remain, and even those could be buried beyond recognition. If this is true for modern materials, then the loss of evidence from far earlier societies becomes even more understandable. There is value in exploring this idea, not because it proves anything specific about the distant past, but because it encourages a careful look at how we interpret the silence of early eras. The absence of evidence in deep time is not the same as evidence of absence. It's simply the result of working with a planet that constantly rebuilds itself. Throughout the world, there are places that once held thriving ecosystems, settlements, or populations, yet today reveal almost nothing about their past. The further back you go, the more pronounced this effect becomes. Some researchers point out that even if a civilization left behind durable structures, we might not recognize them if they were heavily eroded or buried. A rectangular foundation might appear to be a natural rock formation. A patterned arrangement of stones might be mistaken for geological layering. Without clear context, it becomes difficult to distinguish intentional construction from natural processes. The deeper the time frame, the more the environment reshapes everything into its own patterns. When scientists search for evidence of early humans, they often focus on specific regions known to preserve remains. Lake shores, caves, volcanic ash layers, and areas with stable sediment conditions provide ideal environments for long-term preservation. But these environments represent only a tiny fraction of the Earth's surface. The majority of landscapes are not suitable for preserving fragile traces. If a civilization existed outside these ideal zones, much of what it created would likely be lost. This is not meant to imply that evidence is being overlooked, or that there are hidden monuments waiting to be discovered. Rather, it highlights the challenge of searching for something that might have existed in forms that don't survive well. The idea of early civilizations is often shaped by our expectations, but expectations can limit the kinds of questions we ask. If the earlier societies built differently, organized differently, or adapted differently, their remains might not match the patterns we're trained to look for. Throughout global archaeology, there are examples where discoveries shifted our understanding of early human capabilities. stone tools found in unexpected locations, evidence of controlled fire earlier than previously thought, traces of symbolic behaviour long before the development of writing. Each discovery expanded the timeline of human behaviour, suggesting that complex abilities might have emerged sooner than once believed. These findings don't point to a lost civilization, but they show how knowledge evolves and how important it is to remain open to new possibilities. As we continue moving forward through this topic, the question isn't whether an early civilization must have existed. It's whether the conditions on Earth could allow for one to rise, develop, and disappear so thoroughly that only faint echoes remain, scattered across landscapes that have been reshaped countless times since. When people think about the earliest signs of order among humans, the image that usually comes to mind is something simple. A group sitting together around a fire, tools being shaped for hunting or gathering, a few shelters placed near one another. These moments feel like the first steps toward organisation, but they also bring up a question about what order actually means in the context of very early societies. At what point does a collection of individuals become something more structured? When does a shared routine evolve into a community? When does a community start operating with patterns that, if given enough time, could resemble something like a civilization? These questions matter when we explore whether a society could have formed long before the ones normally discussed, because order doesn't arrive all at once. It begins gradually, with small choices accumulating over generations. If you look at early human groups based on what archaeology can confidently show, you find patterns of behaviour that appear again and again. People gathered near water sources, they returned to locations seasonally, they shared responsibilities in ways that increased their chances of survival. These basic tendencies exist in groups of animals as well, but in humans the patterns grow more complex. Cooperation becomes more flexible, planning becomes more deliberate, tools become more specialised. When these developments occur together, the result is something that lays the groundwork for societal structure long before any written record appears. Some of the earliest signs of this shift come from places where groups consistently return to the same site for many generations. Even if they did not build permanent structures, the repeated use of a location suggests that the area held shared meaning, or that it provided reliable resources. Over time, the familiarity of a place can lead to more coordinated activities. People learn the terrain, understand the patterns of seasons there, and build expectations about what they will find when they return. If a site becomes central to a group's survival, then shared rules or customs might form around how it is used. These early forms of order might seem small, but they create the foundation for something much larger. A single decision to stay near a reliable source of water can encourage families to remain close to one another. That proximity can lead to more consistent cooperation. Once groups stay in one area longer than usual, they may begin building more permanent shelters. Those shelters, even if made from fragile materials, give a sense of stability. Stability supports long-term planning. Long-term planning encourages systems that feel increasingly like the first sparks of organised society. The transition from wandering hunters to more settled communities did not happen evenly across the world. In some regions, environmental pressures kept groups mobile for tens of thousands of years. In others, conditions created opportunities for longer-term settlement. But even among groups that continued to travel, there are signs that order didn't depend entirely on being sedentary. Some mobile societies had complex traditions, group structures, and knowledge systems that persisted over generations. These societies might not have left behind grand architecture, but their internal order could be advanced in its own way. Imagine a landscape where groups of early humans gather during a particular season. They hunt, share food, and teach their young the skills required to survive. Within these gatherings, patterns begin to form. Older individuals pass knowledge to younger ones. People take on specialised roles. Some are better at tracking animals. Others excel at making tools. Some learn to prepare food efficiently. Others become the ones who help settle disputes or make decisions. These roles do not need formal titles to be influential. Over time, they become part of the group's identity. As these roles continue for generations, knowledge becomes organized. Stories develop around how to do certain tasks. Methods become standardized. If a particular way of crafting a tool is consistently effective, it becomes the norm. If a method of preserving food works well, people remember and refine it. These small organizational behaviors accumulate, creating a structure that might not be written down but is deeply ingrained. When a group with this kind of structure interacts with another group, they exchange knowledge, materials, and ideas. This exchange adds yet another layer to the development of order. One of the strongest drivers of an early order was the ability to control fire. Fire allowed groups to cook food, stay warm, protect themselves from predators, and gather in larger numbers without dispersing each night. A maintained fire requires cooperation. Someone must watch it, feed it, and ensure it doesn't spread uncontrollably. This responsibility creates shared expectations, and shared expectations lead to simple rules. As these rules become accepted, they influence other aspects of group behavior. Even something as simple as deciding where to place a fire within a gathering site can mark the beginning of planning. If groups grew large enough, they might face new challenges. Disagreements about resources, disputes over roles, or conflicts between families could pressure the group to develop ways to manage tension. These ways might be based on tradition, respect for elders, or established routines. With each solution, the group grows more structured. Over time, these developing systems form the distinction between a group of individuals merely living side by side and a community with shared order. Some evidence of these early forms of order appears in the archaeological record through the distribution of tools at ancient sites. In some areas, stone tools are found arranged in ways that suggest specific activity zones. One area might have been used for cutting plants, another for shaping stone, another for preparing food. These patterns imply that people understood where certain tasks should take place. That understanding doesn't arise randomly. It comes from repetition and teaching. It becomes a habit, and habits form the backbone of early organization. Additionally, early burial practices offer clues about social structure. In some ancient sites, individuals were buried with simple objects that held personal significance. Others were placed in graves that suggest intentional care. When a group takes the time to bury its dead, it indicates a shared belief or value system. Belief systems, even in their simplest forms, require communication and agreement. That agreement reflects order because it shows that multiple individuals collectively follow a set of expectations. Another factor in the early formation of order is the sharing of food. Evidence from some ancient sites suggests that food was not always consumed individually, but shared within the group. Sharing requires trust. Trust leads to cooperation. Cooperation supports the development of group stability. When people rely on each other for survival, they begin to coordinate their actions, even if the coordination is informal. With enough time, informal coordination becomes tradition. Tradition becomes structure. If early humans began organizing themselves in these ways hundreds of thousands of years ago, then it becomes easier to imagine how such order might grow into something larger. A society doesn't need written laws to be structured. It only needs shared rules that people follow. Over generations, these rules evolve. Some become more efficient, others are replaced. Some become so essential that they guide the behavior of the entire group. When a set of unwritten rules becomes strong enough to influence daily life, it marks the beginning of social order. In exploring the possibility of a very early civilization, it's important to understand that the first sparks of order don't require sudden leaps in complexity. They require time, consistency, and the accumulation of small developments. If groups remained stable, communicated widely, and continued improving their methods, then the steps toward a more organized society could emerge naturally. The leap from organized group to civilization isn't a single event. It unfolds slowly, driven by generations of trial and error. Another interesting aspect of early order is the development of tools and the knowledge behind them. When someone learns how to create a specific type of tool they might teach others, teaching requires intention. It also requires a system for passing information effectively. If tool-making knowledge spreads across groups, it suggests some form of communication network. These networks might not be formal alliances, but they still create connections between groups that can shape cultural development. Over long periods, these networks could lead to shared techniques across wide regions. If one group develops an especially effective tool design, others might adopt it. This pattern resembles the early stages of cultural exchange. Cultural exchange is a fundamental building block of civilization. It allows knowledge to spread farther than any single group could take it alone. Even if the materials used were simple, the act of sharing and adapting knowledge indicates an ordered system. Environmental pressures also push groups toward organization. Droughts, cold periods, or shortages force people to collaborate in ways they might not when resources are plentiful. If groups learn to store food, predict seasonal changes, or move strategically based on environmental cues, they developed early forms of planning. Planning distinguishes organized societies from loosely coordinated ones. Even a simple plan, repeated reliably, becomes a part of a group structure. Early humans also developed ways to communicate complex ideas. Although spoken language did not emerge all at once, gradual improvements in verbal communication would have allowed groups to coordinate more effectively. Better communication supports more complex forms of order. Instructions become clearer. Shared goals become more precise. Disputes can be settled through discussion rather than conflict. With each improvement in communication, the potential for organized behavior grows. Another key element of early order is the management of space. When groups return to the same area repeatedly, they might begin arranging their shelters in predictable patterns. A designated area for fire, a place for gathering, a location for tools. These arrangements are not random. They emerge from the experiences of generations. Over time, the layout of a site reflects the group's understanding of efficiency and safety. Even without walls or permanent buildings, spatial arrangements indicate thought and planning. In some regions, evidence suggests that early humans gathered in larger numbers than previously assumed. Large gatherings require coordination. Coordinating groups of this size means that individuals must follow shared expectations. These gatherings might have been for seasonal hunts, resource collection, or rituals tied to natural cycles. Whatever the purpose, the presence of large coordinated groups strengthens the idea that early order could form long before what we officially classify as civilization. If we imagine this process continuing over long stretches of time, we see how order could build without anyone consciously deciding that a civilization was forming. A society doesn't begin when someone declares it. It begins when enough people live in a way that depends on structured cooperation. The structure grows layer by layer, shaped by shared experiences, environmental demands, and the passing of knowledge. As the earlier sparks of order continue to build, patterns emerge that influence how people act even during ordinary tasks. Where they gather, how they prepare food, how they teach their children, how they settle disagreements, how they respond to threats, how they adapt when the environment changes. These patterns become the framework of daily life. Over many generations, this framework becomes so familiar that it feels foundational. All of these developments create a picture of early human organization that is more dynamic than the simple images often presented. People were not simply surviving. They were learning, adapting, teaching, and creating systems that supported their communities. Whether those systems eventually evolved into something much larger is a question that becomes more interesting once we consider how order can spread across distances and accumulate into something more structured. When people imagine the distant past, they often picture landscapes filled with simple shelters, scattered groups of hunters, and long stretches of quiet wilderness where human influence was minimal. It's a familiar picture because it fits comfortably within the framework of what we've been taught. But once you step back far enough, the scale of time becomes so enormous that the familiar picture becomes only one of countless possibilities. During the hundreds of thousands of years before written history, the Earth saw countless cycles of climate, migration, and adaptation. In that vast stretch of time, the possibility opens that something more complex might have existed than the scattered groups we commonly picture. To consider this idea seriously, it helps to think about what the world looked like before the first recognized civilizations, before the earlier cities, before agriculture, before people settled in permanent homes. There were periods when the climate was stable enough, resources abundant enough, and landscapes varied enough that larger groups could have formed. Even without modern tools, these conditions create the potential for societies that are far more organized than the ones we typically assign to early humans. If enough generations lived under favorable conditions, even simple patterns could accumulate into something larger. Picture a region where resources are unusually consistent, perhaps a valley with a reliable water source, fertile soil, and abundant plants and animals. A place where harsh winters are rare and seasonal shifts are predictable. Over time, such a region could support larger populations. If groups began returning to the same area year after year, their familiarity with the land would increase. They would learn which plants grew where, which animals migrated through, which materials were useful for tools. This knowledge, once shared across generations, forms the beginning of sustained organization. If the population in this region grew gradually, new social dynamics would emerge. More people means more tasks to manage. Food gathering, tool making, shelter construction, and group coordination all become more complex when the number of individuals increases. With complexity comes the need for roles. Roles lead to expectations. Expectations lead to systems that feel familiar even if they are unwritten. These are the early ingredients of a society. They do not require writing, advanced technology, or monumental architecture. They only require stability, communication, and time. Across thousands of years, these dynamics could create a network of settlements within a region. People might move between sites depending on seasons or resources, but they would still share similar tools, traditions, and methods. If these groups interacted frequently, their cultural practices could spread across wide areas. When practices spread over generations, they can become surprisingly sophisticated, even without leaving behind strong archaeological evidence. Much of early human innovation involved materials that decay quickly. Fibers, wood, hides, and simple adhesives are examples. These materials do not survive deep time, but they could support surprisingly effective tools and structures. Imagine shelters made from wood and woven materials that lasted for many years, but left almost no trace after thousands. Imagine storage pits lined with leaves or bark. Imagine fishing nets, baskets, and snares made from plant fibers. Imagine cooking pits, gathering areas, and simple paths worn into the ground over generations, only to be covered by shifting sediment long ago. None of these would remain visible today, yet they could support communities far more organized than the simplistic image often associated with the early past. In a world before our world, order might have formed slowly until it became part of daily life. People might have established routines around planting and harvesting wild crops, even before formal agriculture developed. There is evidence that early humans encouraged the growth of certain plants long before they intentionally farmed. If this practice continued over many generations, the result might look like primitive cultivation. Such activity could support larger populations and reduce the need for constant movement. With more settled routines, knowledge evolves further. Groups develop more predictable cycles. Predictability supports planning. Planning supports sustained growth. One of the challenges in imagining such a world is that most of these developments leave behind little physical evidence. The earliest farming experiments often involved plants that do not fossilize well. Simple irrigation attempts might be erased by floods. Wooden tools rot. Paths disappear. Structures collapse and scatter. Over tens of thousands of years, the land reshapes itself so thoroughly that even deep traces fade. If people in this early world built anything more durable, it might have been modest. Stone foundations, fire pits, or simple walls made from stacked rocks could serve practical purposes without looking like monuments. If these structures were later disrupted by erosion, plant growth, or tectonic activity, they might blend naturally into the environment. Without clear context, even trained archaeologists might dismiss them as natural formations. When ancient evidence reaches a certain threshold of weathering, it no longer resembles anything human-made. It's possible that in this early world, cooperation extended beyond single groups. Neighbouring settlements might have shared information about resources, migrations, or seasonal changes. If these interactions repeated over centuries, they could form regional networks. Networks like these are a major step toward a civilization. They allow knowledge to travel farther than any single group could carry it alone. They also create opportunities for cultural exchange, agreement on shared practices, and the spread of innovations from one area to another. If such a network existed long before our recorded past, its influence might be invisible today. Knowledge can move independently of durable objects. Methods for preparing food, storing resources, or managing group activities can persist without leaving clear archaeological traces. Even practices that seem complex can rely on materials that fade quickly. A society might have had intricate social roles, elaborate traditions, or specialized skills without producing artifacts that survive more than a few millennia. The question of population size also becomes important when considering this early world. If environmental conditions supported larger populations, then the potential for sustained organization increases significantly. A group of a few dozen people can cooperate effectively, but their impact remains small. A group of several hundred living in multiple connected sites can develop more stable structures. They can gather food more efficiently, plan for lean seasons, and manage conflicts within the group. The more stable a group becomes, the more energy it can invest in improving its knowledge and techniques. Another aspect of this early world is the role of climate. Throughout human history, climate changes have shaped where people could live and how they survived. There were periods when climate conditions were favourable for long-term settlement. Warm, stable climates support abundant plant and animal life. These periods might have allowed early humans to experiment with new forms of living. If they remained in one place long enough, they would develop deeper relationships with the land. Those relationships form the basis of structured societies. During these stable periods, groups might have built larger gathering spaces. They might have developed rituals or traditions tied to seasonal events. These rituals could create unity across generations, reinforcing a shared identity. Even in simple societies, shared identity can lead to long-term cohesion. Cohesion is essential for maintaining order and expanding it over time. Another possibility in this early world is the development of simple trade. If groups specialized in different forms of resource gathering or tool-making, they might have exchanged goods. Trade networks do not require roads, carts, or markets. They can form through repeated interactions during seasonal gatherings. Over many generations, these exchanges could spread materials and ideas across wide regions. Once trade becomes a stable part of life, societies become less isolated. Less isolation means more opportunities for innovation to spread. If we imagine generations living within these networks, improving tools, practicing early forms of cultivation, organizing group activities, and passing down knowledge, then the idea of a society forming long before our known civilizations becomes less speculative. It becomes a natural extension of how human populations behave when given enough time and stability. A world before our world would not need to resemble anything modern. Its structures could be small, its traditions could be simple, its tools could be modest. Yet its organization could still be far more advanced than the fragmentary evidence left behind suggests. In this early world, people might have formed social practices that feel familiar. They might have gathered in large groups during certain seasons. They might have held shared meals or gatherings marking important moments. They might have developed ways to recognize leadership or settle disputes. They might have established patterns for distributing responsibilities among group members. These practices shape how societies function. Once patterns like these become consistent across generations, they become the quiet framework of a civilization in its earlier stage. Nothing about this framework requires modern technology. It requires patience, cooperation, and repetition. Over long enough periods, repetition becomes tradition. Tradition becomes expectation. Expectation becomes structure. And structure, even in its simplest form, supports societies that can grow beyond what we usually imagine for early humans. If this world existed far earlier than we recognize, its disappearance could be explained by natural forces alone. A shift in climate could make the region less hospitable. A drought could reduce food availability. An epidemic could weaken the population. A volcanic eruption could scatter groups across new territories. When a society is dispersed, its knowledge becomes vulnerable. Without consistent teaching, specialized skills fade. Without shared customs, unity dissolves. Without unity, the structure that once held the society together weakens. Over enough generations, the memory of that structure could vanish completely. Later populations might inherit their land without knowing who lived there before. They might find scattered stones or unusual patterns in the soil, but interpret them as natural features. Without written records, the story of that early society would disappear. Only faint traces would remain, buried deep beneath shifting layers of sediment and time. Considering this possibility also leads to questions about how many times early societies might have formed and dissolved before the ones we study today. Human evolution spans a timescale far longer than recorded history. It is possible that groups rose to complexity, lost their stability, and fragmented again without leaving behind strong evidence. These cycles could have occurred repeatedly across different regions. Each time, the survivors might have carried forward basic skills but lost the larger structure that once existed. Over millennia, memories fade, landscapes change, and early societies become unrecognizable in the archaeological record. Exploring the idea of a world before our world is not about rewriting history, but about acknowledging the vastness of time and the limited evidence we have. It reminds us that the visible layers of human civilization represent only a small fraction of what may have happened on this planet. The deeper we look, the more we realize that much of human experience remains buried, not because it never existed, but because time is relentless in its ability to erase. The deeper you move into the idea of a world that might have existed long before our recorded story began, the more you encounter the problem of missing evidence. Not because anyone intentionally hid anything, but because the Earth is an active planet that changes constantly. Everything on the surface is temporary when measured across geological time. Cultures come and go, landscapes rise and fall. Materials that feel permanent in the moment eventually wear down into something unrecognizable. When you start looking at human history across hundreds of thousands of years, the question is no longer whether something existed, but whether anything from that time could realistically last long enough for us to find today. This challenge is often described by scientists in different ways, but the core idea can be thought of as the problem of ancient echoes. If something happened long ago, the echo of its existence might reach us only faintly, if at all. The echo might be distorted, partial, or so quiet that it blends into natural patterns. Even if it reaches us, we may not understand what it represents. This is the central difficulty when considering the possibility of an early civilization. Not whether it existed, but whether its traces could survive long enough for us to recognize them in the present. To understand why this is such a challenge, it helps to think about how quickly human structures begin to disappear when they are no longer maintained. Modern buildings seem sturdy, but even reinforced concrete breaks down under constant exposure to weather. Steel rusts, wood rots, glass shatters, plastic becomes brittle. If you leave a city untended for a few centuries, the environment begins to reclaim it. Plants grow through cracks, water seeps into foundations, and animals settle inside abandoned structures. After 1,000 years, many buildings would collapse into piles of rubble. After tens of thousands, the rubble would be covered by soil or broken down into fragments. After hundreds of thousands, the remaining traces would be buried beneath new layers of earth or compressed into something that no longer resembles a human-made object. If this is what happens to modern materials, the challenge becomes even greater when considering societies that might have used simpler tools. Groups relying on wood, fibre, bone, or mud structures would leave behind evidence that disappears far faster. Even stone, which survives much longer than organic materials, can wear down until it blends into natural formations. A simple rock wall erodes, a carefully shaped stone becomes smooth, a large structure collapses, breaks apart, and eventually becomes indistinguishable from the surrounding landscape. Over long enough periods, almost everything loses its original shape. Erosion plays a major role in this disappearance. Rain, wind, rivers, and frost all work against human-made structures. Rain washes away soil and destabilizes foundations. Wind carries sand and dust that sandblast surfaces over time. Rivers change course, cutting into old deposits and carrying away whatever lies in their path. Frozen water expands within cracks, breaking apart even the hardest rock. Over millennia, these processes can erase entire building sites. Even a large settlement, if abandoned early enough, could be reduced to nothing. Sediment movement adds another layer of difficulty. In many parts of the world, layers of soil accumulate slowly but steadily. Dust from distant regions settles across the land. Floods deposit new layers of silt. Volcanic ash spreads across large areas. Over thousands of years, these layers become thick. Anything left on the surface or buried shallowly can be lost beneath them. Later generations might never know that something lies below unless they dig in precisely the right place. Even then, geological processes might have compressed, folded, or distorted the layers so much that any evidence becomes hard to interpret. Earth's crust is also shaped by tectonic activity. Continents shift over long periods. Regions that were once flat plains can rise into mountain ranges. Areas that were once near the coast can become far inland. Earthquakes reshape landscapes. Volcanoes create new layers while destroying old surfaces. When surfaces are subducted into the Earth's interior, they're heated and transformed, erasing almost all traces of what they once held. A civilization existing before these processes took place would have its remains scattered or destroyed. Water has an especially strong influence on what survives. Coastlines change dramatically over time. During ice ages, sea levels drop, exposing land that later becomes submerged. Entire regions that once supported human populations might now be under hundreds of meters of water. Underwater environments accelerate decay. Wood dissolves. Plant fibers disappear. Stone becomes encrusted with marine growth or slowly dissolves if exposed to certain chemical conditions. Unless something was buried in sediment quickly enough to be protected, underwater traces vanish over long periods. Even in the best conditions, the window for preserving evidence is narrow. Archaeological discoveries usually come from places where the environment happened to protect materials. Frozen ground, dry caves, volcanic ash layers, and anaerobic conditions can slow decay significantly. But these environments represent rare exceptions. The vast majority of human activity took place in areas where preservation is poor. When considering very early societies, the odds of their remains ending up in one of these rare protective zones are extremely small. Even if something did survive, identifying it becomes another challenge. Without clear context, a human-made object might look natural. A shaped stone could be mistaken for a naturally fractured rock. A buried structure might resemble geological layering. A fragment of material might lose its defining features. The deeper the evidence lies in time, the harder it becomes to distinguish it from natural formations. Archaeologists rely on patterns, clusters of artifacts, shapes that indicate human intention, or layers that show repeated activity. But if the traces are too scattered, weathered, or incomplete, the patterns disappear. Another difficulty involves scale. If an early society never grew large, then the amount of material it left behind would be small. A handful of settlements, each using fragile materials, would not create the same archaeological footprint as large, dense cities. Many societies that existed during known periods of history left behind almost nothing because their structures were simple. Over deeper time, these faint signals become even harder to detect. A small population practicing simple methods of organisation may never leave behind anything that lasts long enough to be found. Cultural practices also influence preservation. If early groups kept their surroundings clean, reused materials frequently, or built in ways that did not accumulate waste, then the archaeological signal would be even weaker. Some societies today generate large amounts of debris, while others leave almost nothing. If a very early society belonged to the latter category, its traces could vanish quickly. Without waste piles, broken structures, or discarded objects, the surface record remains thin. Climate cycles further complicate the problem. Periods of extreme cold or heat shape the environment differently. During cold periods, glaciers scrape away surface layers, exposing some regions while burying others. During warm periods, plant growth accelerates decay and hides traces under soil. Flood cycles reshape valleys. Droughts expose land, only to have later rains wash it away. These cycles repeat over tens of thousands of years. Each cycle removes a portion of the past. If you zoom out far enough, the combined effect of these forces becomes overwhelming. A settlement built 50,000 years ago might stand a chance of leaving a few recognizable traces under ideal conditions. A settlement built 200,000 years ago has far lower odds. A settlement built 1 million years ago would almost certainly be erased. These numbers matter when exploring the idea of a civilization far earlier than the ones we know. The deeper the time frame, the more extreme the erasure. There is also the challenge of how human ancestors varied across different periods. Early humans did not all behave the same way. Different species coexisted. Their abilities, habits, and tools varied. Some groups might have had more advanced techniques while others remained simple. If one group developed a structured society, but lived alongside groups with different practices, the archaeological record would contain a mixture of signals. Without clear signs of advanced materials, it would be difficult to identify which traces belong to which group. Over time, as everything eroded, the distinction would disappear. Another issue is that most archaeological exploration focuses on specific time periods. Researchers examine layers that are known to hold certain kinds of artifacts, and they often interpret other layers based on what they expect to find. If evidence in an unexpected layer does not match known patterns, it may be dismissed as natural or irrelevant. This isn't a flaw in research, it's a limitation imposed by how difficult it is to study deep time. Without clear signals, it becomes easy to overlook faint ones. This is especially true for large-scale patterns. If a society left behind distinctive rock formations or shaped terrain, erosion could soften those features until they appear natural. Over long enough periods, hills, mounds, and terraces can lose their original shapes. Today, many landscapes that look untouched might actually have been influenced by ancient activity. Without precise measurements and clear contrasts, identifying these influences becomes nearly impossible. Even chemical traces pose challenges. Fires leave behind charred material, but charcoal can survive only under certain conditions. Buried charcoal can be disturbed by animal activity, plant roots, or soil processes. In some environments it dissolves completely. Traces of food preparation, pigments or adhesives, degrade chemically over time. Without these signals, the material record becomes quieter. Tools made from stone survive far longer, but even they can lose distinguishing marks. Edges wear down. Surfaces become polished by wind or water. Breaks caused by natural processes can mimic the shapes created by human hands. Without clear and repeated patterns, isolated artifacts are hard to interpret confidently. Many shaped stones found today could be tools or could be natural fractures. Without context, certainty is rare. The deeper this echo problem becomes, the more you realise how much is unknown about the early past. Not because the evidence doesn't exist, but because most of it has been erased, buried, transformed, or scattered. This uncertainty does not prove that an early civilization existed, but it shows why the absence of evidence cannot fully answer the question. If traces can vanish so easily, then the silence we see today may not reflect what once was. Exploring this idea invites a different perspective. Instead of assuming that everything important leaves behind clear evidence, it becomes reasonable to accept that the earliest chapters of human history might be far more complex than the limited fragments discovered so far. The Earth is not a static archive. It is a constantly shifting system where only the luckiest and most durable traces survive. When people think about technology in the distant past, the images that come to mind usually involve simple stone tools or basic wooden structures. It feels natural to imagine early humans working with only the most straightforward materials, shaping the world around them in ways that leave behind obvious, durable traces. But when exploring the possibility of a society that emerged long before the earliest recorded civilizations, it becomes necessary to rethink what the word technology even means in that context. It doesn't have to refer to metal, machinery, or anything resembling the tools of recent history. Technology can be any method, system, or object that improves survival, efficiency, or comfort. And when you explore it through that lens, the picture of early human capability expands significantly. The first thing to consider is that humans have always been problem solvers. Long before cities developed, even before agriculture took shape, people found ways to work with their environment that went far beyond simple instinct. They learned to control fire. They crafted specialized tools. They created clothing suited to their climate. They shaped materials based on need. These abilities represent technological progress, even if they seem small compared to later developments. If these basic skills evolved steadily for thousands of years under the right conditions, they could lead to surprisingly complex outcomes. One of the challenges in thinking about early technology is that most of the materials people used were perishable. Plant fibers, leather, wood, and simple adhesives degrade rapidly. If an early society built structures primarily from organic materials, those structures would disappear quickly once abandoned. A wooden framework, woven walls, or roofing made from leaves could stand for years, but over long periods they would rot, collapse, and blend into the soil. Even tools made from bone or antler can decay or break down in the wrong conditions. If these were the main materials used in a technological system, then the evidence left behind would be almost impossible to identify after tens of thousands of years. This idea changes how we think about what might have existed long before the technologies recorded in archaeology. Early groups could have developed systems for building shelters that were advanced for their time without leaving behind the stone foundations we expect from later civilizations. They might have created large communal structures from wooden beams, reinforced with plant fibers or earth. They could have built storage containers from woven materials, created efficient cooking setups, or mastered construction techniques that were stable and functional but fragile in the long term. All of this falls within the definition of technology. If early societies developed specialized crafts, those crafts would rely heavily on natural materials that are now gone. Skilled individuals might have known how to carve wood with precision, how to produce fibers strong enough to make nets, or how to bind materials together in ways that allowed for complex weaving or construction. They may have created tools with fine edges or unique shapes that assisted in hunting, food preparation, or building. These tools could have been passed between generations, improving gradually as people refined their methods. If none of these tools were made from metal or stone, they would leave behind minimal archaeological signatures. Consider how many modern-day objects would vanish if left outside for a few centuries. Baskets fall apart, fabrics disintegrate, wooden tools decompose, rope frays, even books turn to powder. If you expand that time frame to tens or hundreds of thousands of years, the disappearance becomes complete. The Earth naturally reclaims anything made from organic materials. Soil microbes break them down. Plants grow through them. Animals scatter or consume them. Water washes them away. In deep time, nothing remains. Another way early technology could have taken shape involves food management. Groups that learned to store food effectively gained a major advantage. Techniques like drying, smoking, fermenting, or burying food in cool pits represent technological solutions. A group that mastered these techniques could survive long winters or seasonal shortages more successfully. If they developed methods for cultivating certain plants, even crudely, this would support larger, more stable populations. Over many generations, these practices could evolve into something resembling early agriculture. Yet early experimentation with cultivation often leaves little behind. Without widespread use of durable tools or permanent fields, the evidence becomes faint. Fire also plays an important role in shaping technological progress. Controlled fire allows for cooking, heating, protection, and even the shaping of tools. Early humans learned to heat-treat materials to make them easier to work with. They created designated fire areas that supported group gatherings. They experimented with using fire to shape landscapes, encourage plant growth, or drive animals during hunts. These practices are forms of environmental management, and if used consistently, they could influence the structure of a society. However, the traces left behind by ancient fires can be difficult to identify after long periods, especially if exposed to erosion or groundwater. As technology improves within a society, people begin dividing tasks more efficiently. Some become skilled tool makers, others become hunters, gatherers, planners, or caretakers. The division of labour is a hallmark of advancing society. It leads to increased specialisation and knowledge growth. If a very early society reached this stage, its technological system would reflect a deeper structure than what is traditionally assumed for early humans. The tools, techniques, and methods used would become more refined across generations. But specialisation doesn't guarantee preservation. A highly skilled craftsperson working with materials that decay leaves behind no more trace than a beginner. Time erases the distinction. One of the most interesting possibilities involves simple engineering. Engineering doesn't require metal frames or large buildings. It can start with understanding how to move heavy objects, how to create stable platforms, or how to direct water using dugout channels or built-up dirt. Even very simple engineering projects could improve daily life significantly. For example, early people could build elevated walkways to stay above wet ground, create storage pits lined with materials that resisted moisture, or shape earthen walls to manage wind. These techniques, if applied consistently across a region, could indicate a relatively advanced society. Yet such structures would vanish quickly unless preserved by rare geological conditions. If these early engineering practices grew more sophisticated over time, they might have led to regional systems that supported cooperation between groups. People might have built shared meeting areas, collective storage sites, or simple pathways connecting one settlement to another. Pathways made from compacted earth can last long after a group disappears, but they eventually fade under natural cycles. Without stone paving or long-lasting markers, these routes would dissolve into the surrounding landscape. Even today, hunter-gatherer trails in some regions can vanish within a generation if left unused. Another area where early technology might have developed is in toolmaking involving composite materials. Composite tools are made from multiple parts, such as a wooden handle, a stone blade, and a binding material like sinew or plant fibre. These tools represent a step toward more advanced thinking. If early humans developed these techniques earlier than currently documented, they might have constructed a wide range of tools that never survived long enough to be identified. The organic components decay first, leaving behind stone pieces that look incomplete. Without the full tool, the technological sophistication is easy to underestimate. Adhesives play an important role in this process. Some early humans used natural glues made from resin, pitch, or boiled plant material. Producing these adhesives requires specific temperatures and careful preparation. If a society learned to use adhesives widely, they could create tools and structures that were sturdy and flexible. These adhesives degrade completely over time, leaving no chemical trace after long periods. An entire technological system built on such materials could vanish as if it never existed. Innovation in hunting techniques also reflects early technological thinking. Coordinated hunting strategies, use of traps, and methods for tracking animals require planning. If groups developed complex strategies, they could sustain larger populations. They might have created efficient shelters near hunting grounds, or built temporary structures to process large quantities of food. These structures might have existed only seasonally, leaving behind minimal remains. The absence of remains does not reflect an absence of sophistication. It reflects the fragility of the materials used. Another possibility involves early use of heat beyond cooking. Under controlled conditions, heat can harden wood, strengthen stone, or change the properties of other natural materials. If early humans experimented with heat in ways that influenced tool-making or construction, this would represent a technological leap. Yet any specific evidence of these practices would be subtle. Heat-altered stone can resemble naturally altered stone. Modified wood does not survive long. Without context, separating these traces from natural occurrences is difficult. Water management could have represented another form of technological advance. Even simple methods like digging channels, improving access to springs, or shaping the ground to control runoff represent early engineering. Groups that controlled water more effectively could remain in certain locations longer, supporting larger gatherings. If such methods existed far in the past, natural erosion and sedimentation would likely erase them. A ditch, even one used for centuries, can disappear when filled by floods or covered by vegetation. Behavioral technology also plays a key role in shaping early societies. Behavioral technology refers to strategies for organizing group life. Rotating tasks, planning hunts, training young members, managing resources, or establishing shared rules are all examples. These strategies leave behind no physical evidence but greatly influence the stability and growth of a group. If early humans developed advanced behavioral systems long before farming or writing existed, the impact on their society would be significant. But without physical artifacts, these developments are invisible in the archaeological record. This invisibility creates a kind of technological mirage. A society might have reached a level of complexity that feels advanced when compared to expectations of early humans, yet appear primitive when viewed through the limited traces that remain. The mirage is not deceit. It is simply the result of how time reshapes the record. The presence of sophisticated ideas and methods might be real, but the visible signals fade until only faint hints remain. Some researchers have suggested that certain unusual archaeological findings could indicate earlier technological experimentation than previously believed. Lightly modified stones found deep within older layers, strange patterns in sediment, charcoal in layers that seem too old for known human activity. These discoveries often have natural explanations, but occasionally they leave open questions. These questions are not proof of a lost society. They are reminders of the limitations of the evidence. They highlight how easily early innovations can go unnoticed or be misinterpreted when the record is incomplete. If early humans experimented repeatedly with tools and methods, they might have developed certain technologies multiple times across different regions. These innovations could rise and fade without becoming widespread. Climate shifts, migrations, or population declines could interrupt progress. When new groups arrived later, they might start from simpler methods even if the land once hosted more complex systems. Over long periods, cycles like these could repeat many times. A region with traces of advanced toolmaking could later be occupied by groups using simpler methods, creating layers of activity that appear inconsistent. Without clear continuity, the full picture becomes difficult to reconstruct. Population dynamics also influence technological development. Larger populations generate more ideas, more experimentation, and more innovation. If a region supported large numbers of early humans during favourable climate periods, technological progress could accelerate. But if environmental changes cause population crashes, the accumulated knowledge could be lost, smaller groups might not retain all the specialised skills, technologies that once defined a region could fade until only a few faint traces survive. Over thousands of years, those traces might disappear entirely. Trade or communication between groups adds another dimension. If early societies exchanged materials or techniques, they could spread innovations far beyond their region. However, if those materials were fragile, the spread would leave little behind. Even today, certain indigenous groups maintain complex tool systems using almost entirely organic materials. If these communities vanish suddenly, their technological footprint would be almost invisible centuries later. Apply this scenario to a time frame hundreds of thousands of years earlier, and the disappearance becomes complete. As technology improves, societies often begin recording knowledge informally. In very early societies, this record would not be written or carved into stone. It would be carried through memory, stories, and teaching. This form of record-keeping is strong as long as the society remains stable. But if the population decreases or scatters, these records weaken quickly. A few generations of disruption can erase the memory of complex methods, leaving only small remnants of what once existed. When descendants rebuild, they may not reach the same level of complexity again for many generations. All of this leads to an important point about imagining early technological systems. They do not have to resemble anything modern. They do not need metals, wheels, or large structures. They could be built entirely from natural materials, shaped by careful planning and methodical improvement. They might include complex weaving, advanced joint construction in wooden structures, efficient food preservation, coordinated land use, and refined hunting systems. These achievements would influence daily life significantly, yet disappear completely over deep time. As you consider the possibility of such a system, it becomes easier to imagine how a sophisticated society could arise early in human history without leaving a clear archaeological footprint. The society could be organized, innovative, and stable, yet built from materials that vanish. Its structures could be functional and effective, yet collapse and decompose. Its tools could be refined but made from substances that do not endure. Even its cultural practices, which might have guided its survival, would vanish if the population changed or scattered. When a society grows steadily over time, it often reaches a point where the systems that once supported it begin to feel strained. This strain doesn't arrive suddenly. It builds gradually, in ways that are easy for people living through it to overlook. The challenges appear in small shifts, subtle imbalances, or unexpected conflicts. These slow changes form the early signs of entropy, the gradual weakening of organized structures that once seemed stable. When imagining a society that might have existed long before our known civilizations, it becomes important to understand how the forces of growth can eventually lead to fragility. A society that develops systems for gathering food, building shelters, coordinating tasks, and maintaining order eventually reaches a level where its survival depends on those systems functioning smoothly. When population increases, the demands on these systems grow. If a group once relied on a few skilled toolmakers, a larger group might require a more organized way of producing tools. If food gathering was once simple, larger numbers might strain the available resources. If leadership was based on shared understanding, increased complexity might require more formal roles. Each adjustment introduces new dependencies. These dependencies create a network of expectations. People expect certain tasks to be completed, They expect resources to be available, they expect traditions to continue. If anything disrupts this network, the entire system becomes less stable. This pattern occurs in all societies regardless of technology level. When a system grows, its stability becomes tied to the continuity of its parts. The larger it becomes, the more vulnerable it is to even small disruptions. Imagine a region where a stable early society has grown across many generations. People understand the land well. They know where to find food, how to build shelter, and how to navigate the environment. They have roles, traditions, and a predictable rhythm to their lives. If this society became large enough, its success would depend on long-term environmental stability. Even slight shifts in climate could change the availability of crucial resources. A subtle change in temperature might alter plant growth. A change in rainfall might reduce access to clean water. These changes might seem small at first, but over time they create pressure on the systems that people rely on. As these pressures grow, people must either adapt quickly or risk losing the stability they built. Adaptation requires experimentation, cooperation, and sometimes significant changes to established routines. But not all societies can adapt at the same pace as the environment shifts. Some practices become so deeply ingrained that changing them feels disruptive. If a society has depended on a particular cycle for generations, adjusting that cycle might create uncertainty. Uncertainty leads to tension. Tension creates cracks in the organization that were once unnoticed. Conflict can also emerge from within. When groups grow, disagreements become more common. These disagreements might involve how resources should be shared, how roles should be assigned, or how decisions should be made. Early societies often rely on informal systems for settling disputes, but informal systems struggle when the population becomes too large. More people means more perspectives, more competing interests, and more potential for division. If leaders or respected individuals struggle to keep the group united, the internal structure weakens. Another source of entropy comes from specialization. As roles become more defined, people depend more on others to perform tasks they themselves no longer know how to do. If only a few individuals know how to make certain tools or gather certain resources, the loss of those individuals can be destabilizing. If knowledge becomes concentrated in small groups, it becomes vulnerable to disruption. If those groups leave, perish, or lose influence, the society's ability to function as it once did decreases. This creates a cycle where the complexity that once supported the society becomes a liability. Information flow also affects stability. In early stages of growth, information spreads rapidly because groups are small. Everyone sees what others are doing. Everyone contributes. But as groups grow, communication becomes slower. Misunderstandings become more frequent. People may disagree about how traditions should be followed. If different settlements interpret the same ideas in different ways, unity begins to fade. This can lead to factions that operate under slightly different rules. Over time, these differences accumulate, creating divisions within the society. Environmental pressures continue to play a significant role as well. A society that grew during a period of stable climate might face challenges if the climate shifts. Colder winters, hotter summers, reduced rainfall, or migrating animals could each create new demands on the population. If people cannot adjust their food gathering strategies quickly enough, scarcity becomes a threat. Scarcity increases tension. Tension erodes cooperation. Cooperation is the foundation of early civilizations, so when it weakens, the entire structure becomes less secure. Territory also influences the onset of entropy. As groups expand their range, they may encounter unfamiliar landscapes that require new strategies. They may face competition from other groups. Competition doesn't always lead to open conflict, but it complicates survival. If resources become contested, cooperation within a society becomes even more important. But competition can also drive groups apart, encouraging them to protect their own interests at the expense of shared goals. Divided priorities weaken the unity necessary for maintaining an organized society. Social structure becomes another point of pressure. When roles become more specialised, hierarchies often form. Some individuals might gain influence because of their skills, age, or experience. Over time, these individuals might accumulate more authority. Authority can be stabilising, but it can also introduce imbalance. If people feel that authority is unevenly distributed, disputes arise. If leaders are unable to resolve problems effectively, trust declines. Trust is essential for keeping the group united. When trust declines, people begin acting independently rather than collectively. Independent actions disrupt established systems, increasing instability. Population growth intensifies these challenges. A larger population requires more food, more shelter, and more coordination. If growth happens too quickly for the society's systems to adjust, shortages become common. Shortages lead to difficult decisions. These decisions might involve prioritizing one group over another, which can create resentment. If people believe they are being treated unfairly, they may withdraw cooperation. When cooperation declines, inefficiency rises. Inefficiency puts further strain on the society's already stressed resources. Disease also plays a significant role. As populations grow and settle more densely, diseases spread more easily. Even minor illnesses can weaken groups that rely heavily on each member's contribution. If a disease affects a large portion of the population at once, essential tasks may not be completed. Food may not be stored properly, tools may not be repaired, shelter maintenance may lapse. These small failures accumulate, creating larger problems. Over time, the society becomes less resilient to environmental changes or external threats. Trade or interaction with other groups can both strengthen and weaken early societies. Trade can introduce new materials, ideas, or methods that improve resilience. But it can also introduce conflict, new diseases, or cultural friction. If a society depends too heavily on trade for essential resources, any disruption in the trade network can destabilize it. If relationships with neighboring groups weaken, the society may lose access to crucial materials. Losing these materials forces people to adjust quickly, often without the knowledge needed to adapt effectively. Cultural variation within a society becomes more pronounced as it grows. Different families, groups, or settlements develop slightly different practices. Over time, these differences become part of their identity. If communication declines or external pressures rise, differences that were once unimportant may become sources of disagreement. Even minor disputes can widen into significant divisions under the right conditions. If these divisions become strong enough, unity fractures. These fractures often show up first in shared rituals, stories, or rules. Groups may begin interpreting shared traditions differently. They may disagree on how certain tasks should be performed. They may choose different leaders or settle disputes in different ways. When the shared cultural framework weakens, the society loses one of the main forces holding it together. Without a unifying identity, people become more likely to prioritize local or individual survival strategies over group cohesion. Environmental disasters magnify these fractures. Floods, droughts, fires, or storms can disrupt an entire region. If the society has not maintained flexibility in its systems, it may struggle to respond effectively. A flood that destroys stored food can create immediate scarcity. A drought that reduces plant growth can weaken the population. A fire that destroys shelters forces people to rebuild. If these events occur during a period of internal tension, recovery becomes difficult. People may blame each other or question leadership. This blame accelerates the decline of unity. The disappearance of key knowledge also contributes to entropy. If a society relies heavily on specific skills held by a limited number of individuals, the loss of those individuals becomes significant. If knowledge is not consistently passed down, certain techniques may be forgotten. A generation might lose the ability to construct strong shelters, prepare food efficiently, or manage resources effectively. As knowledge fades, people revert to simpler methods. Simpler methods often require more labour or produce fewer resources, increasing the strain on the group. Once knowledge begins to fade, it can disappear quickly. Skills that took centuries to refine may vanish within a few generations. Without those skills, the society becomes less capable of sustaining itself. The loss of knowledge accelerates the weakening of systems already under pressure. Fragmented groups may try to maintain their traditions, but without a strong foundation, they struggle. Fragmentation leads to more fragmentation, until only small communities remain. As these small communities drift away from one another, the memory of the once larger society fades. Over time, stories change, traditions shift, details are lost. Without written records or durable artifacts, the knowledge of what once existed becomes thinner. Eventually, only the faintest hints remain, scattered across generations and landscapes. These hints might take the form of unusual stone arrangements, patterns in soil, or shared habits between distant groups. But without continuity, these hints become isolated pieces that are difficult to interpret. Entropy in early societies also reflects the way people respond to stress. Under pressure, groups often become more defensive or isolated. They may avoid contact with outsiders, they may guard resources more tightly, they may abandon previously successful strategies in favour of more immediate survival tactics. These decisions might help temporarily but weaken the long-term structure of the society. Once isolation sets in, the flow of information slows further. Without shared knowledge or coordinated effort, the society's organisation becomes unstable. There is also the possibility that some early societies developed methods that were highly effective in their environment but not adaptable to new conditions. If their systems were optimised for a specific climate, resource distribution, or landscape, any significant shift could render those systems ineffective. A method that worked perfectly in a stable period might fail entirely during a transitional one. When methods fail, groups that rely on them must reorganize quickly, but rapid reorganization is difficult when pressure is high. If reorganization fails, fragmentation becomes inevitable. Over long periods, these patterns accumulate until the society is no longer recognizable as the organized structure it once was. People may remain in the region, but the coherence that defined their shared identity disappears. Without that coherence, the society dissolves into smaller groups that rely on simpler methods. These groups may continue living in the same region, but without the systems that once held them together, they no longer represent a unified society. Later generations may inherit only fragments of the earlier knowledge, unable to reconstruct the full picture. The disappearance of these systems leaves behind little evidence of what once existed. If the society used mostly organic materials, built modest structures, and left behind minimal waste, the archaeological record becomes almost silent. The only traces might be a few shaped stones, scattered charcoal, or faint soil disturbances. Without context, these signals look like ordinary signs of early human activity. The complexity that once existed disappears from view, leaving behind only a simple impression of a society that never reached an advanced stage. Understanding this pattern of entropy helps explain how a society in deep history might have risen to significant complexity and later dissolved without leaving behind convincing evidence. The same forces that shape known civilizations, growth, specialization, environmental pressure, internal conflict and knowledge loss, would apply to any society, regardless of how early it formed. These forces, when combined, can reduce even the most organized structure back into scattered groups whose traces become nearly invisible over time. When a society reaches the point where its structure begins to stretch beyond what it was designed to handle, the strain often goes unnoticed at first. People carry on with daily routines. They rely on familiar systems, assuming those systems will continue to function the same way they always have. It is only when pressures begin to accumulate quietly, in ways that do not draw attention, that the early signs of unravelling take root. These signs can appear in different places at different moments, and each sign by itself might seem unimportant. Together, however, they mark the beginning of a long decline. In imagining an early society that existed before anything recorded, the process of unravelling might begin with small disruptions. A shift in weather patterns reduces the availability of certain plants, a hunting region becomes less reliable, a nearby water source becomes unpredictable. None of these events alone threaten collapse, but they require small adjustments. Those adjustments change established routines. When routines change, people must spend more time solving problems that were once simple. The extra effort pulls attention away from other parts of their system, weakening them slightly. Over long enough periods, these slight weakenings accumulate. In a society that depends on cooperation, even minor disruptions in trust or communication can create lasting strain. If one settlement begins struggling with resource shortages, neighbouring settlements might hesitate to share, not out of hostility, but out of concern for their own survival. This hesitation creates friction. Groups may begin making decisions more independently, which gradually loosens the ties that once connected them. The larger the society becomes, the harder it is to maintain the unity required to navigate periods of difficulty. As unity weakens, disagreements grow more common. People might argue over the best way to gather resources, how to distribute food, or which traditions should take priority. These disagreements rarely appear as sudden arguments. Instead, they emerge as subtle shifts in behaviour. Someone stops following a particular practice because they believe it no longer works. Another group begins protecting its own supplies more carefully. Leaders or respected individuals find it harder to maintain influence as groups become more focused on local issues. These small changes widen the distance between settlements or families, a distance that was once held together by shared routines. Another challenge comes from the gradual loss of knowledge. When people are forced to relocate or adapt quickly, certain skills no longer fit the new conditions. A technique that once worked well might become less useful. If a generation grows up under pressure, they might not learn practices that were once essential. If they attempt to adapt old knowledge to new conditions without fully understanding it, mistakes become common. These mistakes reduce efficiency and create frustration. Over time, the accumulation of small gaps in knowledge weakens the society's foundation. The fading of traditions plays a significant role in the unravelling. Traditions help maintain continuity across generations. They provide structure, shared meaning, and predictable behaviour. When a society faces strain, traditions may seem less important than immediate needs. People might skip certain rituals to save time. They might ignore customs that feel burdensome when resources are limited. Each time a tradition is neglected, a piece of cultural cohesion disappears. Without these shared behaviours, the sense of belonging that once held the society together becomes thin. Environmental pressures continue to push the society toward instability. A long drought forces some groups to relocate. Relocation creates new challenges. People must adapt to unfamiliar landscapes, different resources, and change patterns of weather. They must rebuild shelters, find new food sources, and re-establish routines. This takes energy, time, and cooperation. If the society is already strained, relocation increases tension. Some groups might refuse to move, others might leave early, still others might split into smaller units. This fragmentation accelerates the unravelling process. As groups become more isolated, communication weakens further. Knowledge spreads unevenly, and misunderstandings increase. People begin developing their own variations of established methods. Techniques that once allowed the society to function smoothly start to diverge. Over time, these differences become too large to reconcile. If groups attempt to coordinate across distances, their communication is inconsistent. A message that once carried clear meaning becomes open to interpretation. These gaps in understanding lead to unintentional conflict or incompatible decisions. Conflicts do not need to be violent to cause harm. A dispute over territory can create long-term resentment. A disagreement about leadership can divide groups permanently. The increased need for resources during difficult periods makes disputes more likely. When people must choose between supporting neighbouring settlements or protecting their own families, they often choose the latter. These choices, although understandable, weaken the larger social system. If the society has developed specialised roles, these roles become harder to maintain under stress. A person skilled in building certain structures might not have the materials they need. A toolmaker may lose access to a specific resource. A leader may struggle to provide guidance when conditions change too frequently. When specialists can no longer perform their tasks effectively, the society loses the benefits of their expertise. Without alternatives prepared, the group must revert to simpler methods. These simpler methods might not support the population as effectively, leading to shortages and increased tension. Another problem arises when younger generations grow up during periods of strain. They learn to survive in a society already weakened. Their expectations are shaped by instability rather than continuity. They may not see the value in maintaining old systems, especially if those systems no longer seem reliable. When they reach adulthood, they may abandon certain practices entirely. This accelerates the disappearance of knowledge and tradition. As each new generation adapts to more difficult conditions, the memory of earlier stability fades. Certain groups might attempt to restore order by tightening control or enforcing old traditions more strictly. These efforts can sometimes slow the unravelling temporarily, but they can also create resistance. If people feel they are being forced to follow methods that no longer fit their needs, they may push back. This pushback creates further division. Rather than repairing unity, strict enforcement can deepen the fractures within the society. At some point, the strain becomes visible in everyday life. Tools break more often because they are made hurriedly. Shelters require more frequent repairs because the knowledge behind their construction has weakened. People spend more time gathering food because resources are less predictable. Illness spreads more frequently in weakened groups. These ongoing challenges reduce the energy available for maintaining the broader structure of the society. People focus on immediate survival rather than long-term planning. Long-term projects stall. Shared goals fade. The decline of the long-distance cooperation has significant consequences. If the society once relied on communication between settlements, the loss of this communication reduces the ability to coordinate large efforts. A region-wide hunting strategy becomes impossible. A shared ritual loses participants. A seasonal event is no longer practiced consistently. Without shared experiences, groups grow apart emotionally as well as physically. Emotional distance makes cooperation even harder when it becomes necessary. Eventually, the society reaches a threshold where it cannot operate as a unified structure. It is still present in the people, the land, and their habits, but the cohesion that once defined it no longer exists. Settlements drift apart in their practices. Some might develop new routines that work better for them. Others might cling to older methods that become less effective over time. A few groups may isolate themselves completely, moving into new regions or adopting entirely different strategies for survival. Although the unravelling is gradual, it creates a long chain of consequences. A loss of shared language patterns makes communication difficult. A decline in travel reduces cultural exchange. The loss of traditions reduces collective identity. A weakening of leadership reduces coordination. When combined, these factors shift the society from a complex, interconnected structure to a collection of smaller, loosely related groups. This process is not dramatic. It is not marked by a single event or a moment of collapse. Instead, it unfolds quietly, with each year bringing small adjustments, each generation losing a little more knowledge, and each group focusing more on its own immediate needs. Over centuries, the once cohesive society becomes a distant memory, preserved only in fragments that later generations might struggle to interpret. If you stood in the middle of this society during the early stages of unravelling, you might not notice anything unusual. People would still gather, work, and share in familiar ways. The routines would continue, at least at first. But if you watched closely, you would notice subtle changes. People would take longer to complete tasks, arguments would last a little longer, travel between settlements would become less frequent. The signs would be small, but their meaning would be significant. As these patterns spread across generations, the society would transform entirely. What once functioned smoothly now encounters repeated obstacles. What once felt unified now feels fragmented. People who once shared a single identity now see themselves as part of smaller, more localized groups. These smaller groups may continue for many generations, but they no longer carry the full complexity of the earlier society. Natural events add further pressure. A flood might destroy a settlement already weakened by reduced cooperation. A fire might force relocation at a time when relocation is already difficult. Each event, no matter how ordinary it might seem, has a larger impact when the society is fragile. If multiple events occur in close succession, the pressure becomes too much for the society to manage. As fragmentation deepens, the ability to store or transmit knowledge drops significantly. Skills that were once widespread become isolated to a few individuals. Techniques that required collaboration are no longer practiced. Rituals that strengthened unity become inconsistent. Over time, the memory of how to conduct certain tasks fades completely. Without these practices, the society loses its ability to maintain anything that resembles its earlier form. The unravelling also affects how people interpret their own past. Without shared stories, people create new explanations for certain traditions or landmarks. They may forget the original purposes of structures, tools, or customs. As interpretations shift, the connection to the earlier society becomes weaker. Eventually, only vague impressions remain, carried through altered stories or faint habits that no longer resemble their origins. When viewed from a distant perspective, the unravelling appears as a transition rather than an ending. The society does not vanish instantly. It spreads out, softens, and diffuses into smaller pieces. These pieces continue living, adapting, and surviving, but without the unified structure that once defined them. Their daily life remains possible, but the larger system has dissolved. This slow fading creates a situation where the traces left behind reflect only the final stages of the society rather than its height. Archaeologists examining these traces might find simple tools, scattered remains, or faint soil disturbances. Without context, they might assume the society was simple throughout its existence. The complexity that once defined it is invisible, because the most advanced stages left behind no durable evidence. Only the simpler remnants remain, giving a misleading impression of the society's full story. This pattern helps explain how even a significant early civilization could disappear almost completely. The transition from organized complexity to scattered groups leaves behind a record that appears unremarkable. The earlier achievements vanish long before the simpler structures do. What remains is a faint outline of something far greater. When the structure of a society is weakened to the point where people drift into smaller groups, the world that remains afterwards settles into a different kind of quiet. It is not the silence of emptiness, because people are still there. It is not the silence of peace, because struggles and pressures continue. It is a quieter landscape shaped by the absence of what once held everyone together. The routines that once connected different regions fade away. The meeting places that once filled with voices become empty. Traditions that guided daily life lose their meaning. It is a silence created by the slow dissolving of connections that once stretched across a large community. In the years following the unravelling, the people who remain still survive, but the coordination that once made life predictable becomes scattered. Groups settle into patterns that suit their immediate environment rather than a broader network. Without the need to align their actions with distant settlements, they adjust to local rhythms. They build shelters where materials are available. They follow food sources that are nearby. They use the knowledge that remains within their smaller circle. What they no longer do is maintain the structured systems that required cooperation across long distances. The complexity that once held their society together has faded, leaving behind simpler habits. This transition is not always visible from the perspective of a single family or group. To them, daily life continues. They gather food, repair their shelters, raise children, and move through familiar tasks. The changes appear only when compared to the broader patterns that existed before. Travel becomes rare. Shared rituals are practiced in reduced forms or not at all. Knowledge that once passed across many regions now circulates within a much smaller area. People no longer think about what neighbouring groups are doing because contact with them becomes infrequent. This shrinking of awareness is one of the quietest aspects of the aftermath, yet it reshapes everything. Over a long enough period, the land itself begins to transform in ways that reflect the absence of large-scale organisation. Pathways fade when no one travels them regularly. Open clearings slowly close as plants take root. Structures built from wood collapse, rot, and blend into the soil. Even stone arrangements, if they were not large or carefully maintained, begin to shift under the pressure of weather. What once marked a gathering site becomes an ordinary patch of ground. What once served as a storage area becomes a mound covered in vegetation. Time continues its steady work, and the traces left by the earlier society grow less noticeable. People in this stage of the aftermath may still remember that their ancestors lived differently. They may have heard stories about larger gatherings or ways of working together that they themselves do not practice. But these memories become vague with each generation. They are repeated in fragments, altered to fit current conditions, or abandoned because they no longer feel relevant. When daily life is shaped by survival within a small area, distant memories drift into the background. If younger generations grow up without experiencing the old systems, those memories gradually lose meaning and eventually fade. This fading is not deliberate. It is the result of living without the structures that once supported a more organised society. When a tradition no longer helps people survive in their new context, it slowly disappears. If a technique requires materials that are no longer available, it becomes impractical. If a story requires cultural knowledge that no longer exists, it becomes confusing. Gradually, the residents of the post-unravelling world live in a present that no longer aligns with the past. The silence after the storm becomes the environment in which new patterns form. During this stage, the population might be smaller than before. Declines can happen for many reasons. Some groups may have left the region, others may have struggled during periods of scarcity. Some may have merged with neighbouring communities, losing parts of their original culture in the process. A smaller population requires fewer resources, which can provide temporary stability. But it also reduces the diversity of knowledge. Fewer people means fewer skills, fewer teachers, and fewer chances to pass down complex methods. As complexity reduces, people rely more heavily on simple routines that demand less coordination. As the population adjusts to this quieter world, they begin using the land differently. Without large gatherings or extensive planning, they rely more on opportunistic survival methods. They gather what is available rather than cultivating specific plants. They move when local resources dwindle instead of managing resources in coordinated cycles. This approach works well enough for small groups, but it lacks the efficiency of the systems that once supported larger populations. These smaller groups adapt to a rhythm shaped primarily by nature rather than by human planning. The landscape gradually shifts from a place shaped by cooperative systems to one shaped by the independent actions of isolated groups. The silence that settles after the unravelling is not absolute. People still speak, teach, and share with those around them, but the voices no longer carry across wide distances. Ideas that once travelled through many settlements now stop after one or two. Without travel or shared projects, the patterns of communication shrink. The land becomes a patchwork of isolated communities that operate independently. These communities may still hold fragments of the old society within their habits, but they do not hold enough to rebuild the broader structure. Some groups may wonder about old places they no longer visit. They might know of a clearing that once hosted large gatherings, but they no longer understand why those gatherings mattered. They may see stones arranged in a certain pattern, but assume they were placed by nature. Over time, curiosity about the past might remain, but the ability to answer those questions fades. Without continuity or preserved records, even simple explanations become difficult. People eventually focus on what is familiar and useful for their immediate lives. As generations pass, the landscape begins to erase the physical traces of what came before. A collapsed shelter becomes covered in soil. The remains of a storage pit fill with sediment. A fire site is washed away by rain or disturbed by animal activity. If the earlier society once practiced any form of cultivation, the plants they encouraged eventually mix back into the natural ecosystem. Without consistent care, landscapes shaped by human planning return to the patterns dictated by climate and terrain. Future generations walking across these areas might never guess that humans once arranged them differently. Settlements themselves may shift or disappear entirely. A group might abandon an area after several difficult seasons. A flood might force them to move to higher ground. A change in migration patterns of animals might require relocation. As they move, any structures or tools left behind deteriorate quickly. Natural processes reclaim them. The plant life grows over them, and the soil swallows what remains. Within a few generations, no one remembers the exact location of old living sites. If any long-lasting structures existed, they may eventually become indistinguishable from natural formations. A pile of stones may lose its shape. A carved rock may erode until the markings are no longer visible. If there were once simple walls or pathways, these features would blend into the landscape as erosion reshaped the land. Without anyone maintaining them, the identity of these structures becomes unclear. They may be interpreted as natural ridges or random stone arrangements, not remnants of human activity. This erasure contributes to the silence after the storm. It is not only the absence of voices or movement, it is the gradual concealing of what once held meaning. As the land continues to change, the distinction between what was built and what formed naturally disappears. Future generations would see only hills, stones, and scattered soil patterns, not the remnants of a once organised society. Without clear evidence, those later groups would assume that their ancestors lived the same way they do, unaware that earlier generations once practiced more complex methods. The people living during this silent stage would not necessarily feel that anything has been lost. Their daily lives are shaped by the present, not by the systems that their ancestors once built. They care for their families, repair their shelters, and adapt to their environment. Even if life is harder or less predictable than it once was, they are accustomed to these conditions. A simpler life feels normal when it is all one has ever known. Over enough generations, the memory of a more organised past fades until it no longer influences daily decisions. As the society becomes smaller and more scattered, some groups may develop new traditions that fit their changed circumstances. These new traditions are based on their immediate environment rather than on long-distance cooperation. They might create rituals tied to local resources. They might develop new methods for tracking seasons or understanding weather. These new practices form the framework of their identity. Even if fragments of the old society survive in subtle habits, the new identity becomes the one that defines them. This process of cultural replacement is not intentional. It is the natural outcome of living without the systems that once supported broader cooperation. When old practices no longer suit new circumstances, people adapt by creating new ones. As these practices repeat across generations, they become the new normal. The old ones become stories, then vague references, then something no one remembers clearly. Eventually, they disappear entirely. Some groups might move into different regions that were once part of the earlier society. They may find strange patterns in the landscape or layers of old soil that differ from their surroundings. But without context, these discoveries have no clear meaning. They become curiosities rather than historical clues. Over time, nature reshapes these areas further, making them even harder to interpret. The silence after the storm deepens as the earth itself hides the evidence. In this quieter world, the interactions between groups become limited. Over vast stretches of time, the small groups that remain may spread out across the landscape without ever realizing they share a distant connection. They develop distinct ways of living that reflect their local conditions. Differences in climate, animals, and resources shape their habits. Without consistent contact, these differences grow. From a distance, they may appear unrelated, even though they share roots in the same early society. As the land continues to evolve, some regions become inhospitable. Changes in climate or natural disasters might force groups to relocate again. Each relocation reduces the chance of preserving any trace of earlier activity. Paths are abandoned, shelters lost, and tools left behind to decay. If people return to those regions centuries later, they find only natural landscapes without evidence of prior habitation. The earth gradually washes away the remaining clues. The silence deepens further as younger generations focus entirely on their current environment. Without knowledge of large-scale connections or organized structures, they interpret their world through immediate experience. They craft tools based on what they see their parents using. They follow patterns that suit the small group they know. They do not wonder about complex systems because such systems no longer exist within their lived reality. Their world is shaped by what is near them, not by what might have been. When storms, droughts, or other challenges occur, they respond using methods relevant to their scale. This may involve finding new areas to gather food, repairing shelters, or seeking temporary refuge. Without broader structures to support them, they rely on adaptability rather than coordination. These responses are effective for small groups, but they do not rebuild the systems that once held larger societies together. Over time, each new challenge reinforces the simplicity of their organization. In this stage, the silence does not mean that human presence has vanished. It means that the noise of coordinated society, with its shared projects and collective identity, has faded. What remains are individuals and families who continue living, adapting, and surviving. Their contributions to the land are modest, leaving behind fewer traces for future generations to find. The world becomes a place where the echoes of the past grow faint. This faintness is not only physical, it is also cultural. The stories that once explained shared origins lose their clarity. The reasons behind certain customs fade until only the actions remain, disconnected from their purpose. People may continue performing certain gestures or repeating fragments of stories without understanding their meaning. These fragments eventually become part of new traditions, blended into the habits that emerge naturally as groups adapt to their environment. Over many generations, the idea of a once unified society becomes a distant memory, then a forgotten one. The early complexity dissolves into a pattern of smaller communities that appear simple in comparison. When later observers look back at the traces that survive, they see evidence of small groups living modestly, unaware that this simplicity represents only the final stages of a long process. The earlier complexity has been washed away by time, leaving behind only the remnants that were strong enough or lucky enough to endure. When enough generations pass after a society has dissolved into smaller fragments, the memory of what once existed becomes increasingly fragile. People continue living in the landscapes shaped by their ancestors, but without the structures that held earlier knowledge together, their understanding of the past becomes thin. Stories that were once detailed become short explanations. Rituals that once carried meaning become simple gestures. Over time, even those gestures lose their purpose. The past recedes not because people choose to forget, but because the systems that once preserved it no longer exist. This slow fading creates something that can be thought of as deep time amnesia, a condition in which the history of an earlier society disappears into the long stretches of time that follow. In the early stages of this amnesia, people might still remember that their ancestors lived differently. They might recall hearing about gatherings that involved many settlements or techniques that no one currently practices. These memories, however, are tied to personal stories rather than organised knowledge. If only a few individuals carry the stories, and if those individuals pass away without teaching them fully, much of the information disappears. The small groups that remain after the unravelling rarely have the means to preserve long, detailed accounts. They rely on oral memory, and oral memory is vulnerable when communication becomes limited. As generations continue passing, memory through stories becomes unreliable. Details shift when retold. Context weakens when listeners lack familiarity with the world described. A story about a large gathering might become a story about a single event. A tradition involving many settlements might be interpreted as involving only one. Without a functioning system to maintain accuracy, stories drift until they no longer reflect the earlier society accurately. Eventually, they become too vague to hold meaning. People might still repeat certain phrases, but the connection to the original events becomes unclear. Environmental change also contributes to this amnesia. If the land shifts, the landmarks connected to old stories lose their relevance. A river that once served as a meeting point might change course over centuries. A forest that once held significance might expand or retreat. Rocks used for certain rituals might erode until they no longer look distinctive. When these landmarks change, the stories associated with them become harder to visualize. Younger generations, seeing no resemblance between the landscape and the stories, may question their accuracy. Doubt leads to disinterest. Disinterest leads to forgetting. Material traces of the earlier society also vanish gradually. Wooden structures rot. Fibers break down. Tools made from bone become brittle. Simple pathways disappear under shifting soil. If anyone stumbles across remains, they often lack the context to interpret them. A decayed wooden frame might be mistaken for natural debris. A faint arrangement of stones might appear random. Even if someone suspects these traces came from earlier people, the absence of clear meaning reduces them to curiosities rather than historical clues. Without stable systems of interpretation, these physical traces contribute little to preserving memory. Once the silence after the unravelling settles fully into the region, groups live without any regular contact with one another. This isolation accelerates the loss of shared memory. Each group develops slightly different explanations for the world around them. These explanations may include vague references to ancestors, spirits, or natural forces, but they rarely include accurate accounts of earlier societies. Without long-distance communication, knowledge cannot be cross-checked or corrected. If a mistaken interpretation becomes popular in one settlement, it may persist for generations. Over time, each group develops its own version of the past, none of which reflect the earlier society with any clarity. This divergence becomes even more pronounced when younger generations grow up without first-hand experience of the remnants left behind. If a stone pattern lies beneath accumulated soil, or if an old clearing becomes forested, future generations see only what the present landscape offers. They learn to interpret the land based on current experiences rather than historical ones. If they encounter artifacts or remains, they may assign new meanings to them, influenced by their immediate surroundings rather than the past. These new interpretations become more believable than the stories passed down, which seem outdated or confusing. Over time, the interpretations become reality for the people living in that period. As the centuries continue, the once unified society that dissolved during the Great Unravelling becomes impossible to detect through living memory. People no longer remember that their ancestors once cooperated across large distances. They no longer know about techniques that required coordinated effort. They no longer understand that their current ways of living were shaped by earlier complexities. They see their present situation as normal and assume their ancestors lived in similar ways. This assumption becomes the basis for their understanding of history, reinforcing the amnesia. In this stage, even if someone notices something unusual in the landscape, such as a stone that looks shaped, or an area where soil layers differ, they lack the conceptual framework to connect it to a forgotten society. They see only isolated details rather than patterns. Without the ability to recognize patterns, the remnants of the earlier society lose their significance. People move past these remnants, unaware that they represent the final scattered traces of a complex structure that once existed. Another factor in deep time amnesia involves the natural tendency for human groups to assume that their present methods are the methods humans have always used. When a group lives in a simple way, they tend to imagine that earlier generations lived similarly. They rarely consider the possibility that earlier societies might have been more complex. This bias reflects the limits of their experience. Without evidence of earlier complexity, they naturally assume continuity rather than change. This assumption quietly reinforces the disappearance of the earlier society from memory. Climate change across long periods further obscures the past. A region once suitable for large gatherings might become unsuitable. Resources that supported earlier populations might disappear. As these changes accumulate, the memory of how the land once supported larger communities fades. If people living in later generations see the land as harsh or limited, they cannot imagine that earlier groups thrived there at a larger scale. Their understanding of the environment becomes another layer that hides the earlier society from view. Migration also plays a role. Over long periods, groups may move into areas once inhabited by the earlier society. These new groups may have no connection to the old traditions or stories. They see the land with fresh eyes, unaware of its history. If they find traces of earlier activity, they interpret them based on their own culture rather than the earlier one. Their interpretations may involve spiritual ideas, practical guesses, or simple observations, but they lack historical accuracy. As time passes, their interpretations become the only explanations available. Even the soil itself contributes to the amnesia. Layers accumulate, burying earlier signs of human activity. Floods move sediment from one area to another. Trees fall and decompose, adding organic material. Animals dig burrows that disturb old layers. Over centuries, the original surface becomes buried so deep that no living person ever sees it. Without excavation or specialized knowledge, the traces remain hidden. People walking above these buried layers remain unaware that they stand atop what was once the center of an earlier society. Occasionally, someone might discover something unusual, an oddly shaped stone, a piece of bone with markings, or a layer of charcoal. But without the tools or context to study it, the discovery becomes a momentary curiosity. It does not lead to a broader understanding. These moments rarely produce lasting insight because they lack continuity. They are isolated encounters with the past, disconnected from any organized effort to interpret them. As a result, they do little to restore memory. Over thousands of years, the deep time amnesia becomes complete. The people living in the region no longer carry any meaningful connection to the earlier society. Their traditions, stories, and methods reflect only the experiences of the recent generations. They may feel rooted in the land, but the roots they imagine do not reach as deeply as they once did. The earlier layers are silent, hidden beneath the surface both physically and culturally. This amnesia does not imply that the earlier society was insignificant. It reflects the nature of human memory across long time spans. Without written records, durable structures, or continuous transmission, even significant societies can vanish from collective understanding. All that remains are subtle hints in the landscape, faint clues embedded in soil and patterns that are visible only when viewed from a perspective far removed from the daily experience of the people who now inhabit the land. For the people living in the aftermath, life continues without a sense of loss. They adapt to their environment, pass down the knowledge they still possess, and maintain the routines that suit their current conditions. Their world is defined by the present rather than the past. If they move to new regions or encounter other groups, they do so without understanding the deeper connection they share. The idea of a once unified society is absent from their worldview. They do not question it because they have no reason to believe anything different occurred. Even if centuries later another group arrives and studies the land, the faint traces of the earlier society might not be recognizable. Soil patterns may appear natural. Stone fragments may seem random. Charcoal layers might be dismissed as accidental fires. Without consistent, widespread evidence, the earlier society remains invisible. This invisibility extends across time, not just across physical space. Generations inherit a world that feels complete without knowing that it once contained more complexity. Their understanding of human history remains narrow, shaped by the limits of the evidence available to them. This narrow understanding becomes the foundation of future interpretations, reinforcing the amnesia further. In this way, deep time amnesia becomes a natural part of the human experience. It reflects how easily entire chapters of human existence can disappear when the systems that once maintained them fall apart. The silence that settled after the storm eventually becomes the new normal. People who live in this new normal carry no sense of what was lost, because the memory of loss disappears along with the memory of the earlier society itself. This idea brings the exploration toward a question that arises whenever people consider the possibility of a forgotten civilization. If entire societies can vanish from memory, what does that say about our ability to recognize patterns in the present? What does it imply about our relationship to earlier times? And how does it shape the way we think about our own place within the long timeline of human existence? When people living in a much later time look around at their world, they often assume that everything they experience is the result of recent developments. The shape of their settlements, the structure of their communities, the way they organize resources, and the rhythms of their routines feel like natural outcomes of their present circumstances. It rarely occurs to anyone that some of these patterns might echo older ones. Not because those older patterns survive consciously, but because human behaviour often responds to similar pressures in similar ways. The deep time amnesia that once erased the memory of an earlier society does not remove the underlying tendencies that shaped that society in the first place. Those tendencies remain part of human nature, resurfacing whenever conditions align in ways that bring them forward again. When people form groups, they tend to develop certain habits. They share food, they manage space, they designate responsibilities, they create explanations for their environment. These patterns appear in many societies across different periods because they address common needs. When an earlier society lost its structure and faded from memory, the habits that once held it together did not disappear completely. They were carried quietly through generations in the form of small, simple behaviours. Even a group that had no knowledge of the earlier complexity still practiced cooperation, division of labour, and shared rituals on a smaller scale. These behaviours make it easier for people to live together, and they re-emerge naturally whenever people settle in groups. This tendency to repeat functional patterns means that later societies may unknowingly recreate aspects of the earlier one. They do not build the same structures or follow the same customs, but they respond to familiar challenges in familiar ways. For example, when a group grows large enough, it often develops a system for settling disagreements. When interactions become frequent, people create rules to manage them. When resources become scarce, they coordinate to distribute them. None of these behaviours require knowledge of the earlier society. They arise because they help people navigate complex environments. As people develop these systems, they sometimes feel as though they are discovering new forms of organisation. In reality, these discoveries may mirror earlier patterns that were once lost. This does not diminish the creativity of the groups who develop them. Instead, it highlights how human problem-solving follows certain predictable paths. When people living in later periods look at their own social structures, they may see reflections of ideas that once existed long before written memory began, shaped by the same pressures and responses that guided earlier societies. The environment also influences which patterns reappear. Groups living in similar climates often face similar challenges. They need to store food, predict seasonal shifts, and manage shelter. These needs encourage people to develop routines that match the rhythm of their surroundings. If groups in different periods inhabit the same region, they may arrive independently at similar solutions. These solutions feel practical because they fit the conditions. Even if no stories remain from the earlier society, The land acts as a quiet guide. People adapt to it in ways that echo the adaptations of those who came long before them. Over time, these patterns create a layer of continuity that extends across many generations. People do not recognize this continuity because their attention is focused on the present. They do not imagine that their daily lives might mirror those of people whose traces have faded almost completely. Without visible evidence, they assume they are the first to solve certain problems. This assumption reinforces their sense of originality, even though the roots of their behaviours extend far into the past. There are moments when people notice something unusual in the landscape or in their routines that raises questions. A certain way of arranging a space might feel instinctively correct. A method for preparing food might seem natural without anyone knowing why. A shared gesture might feel familiar even though no one remembers when it began. These small moments reflect the ways in which deeply ingrained patterns survive across long periods. They are not preserved consciously, but they re-emerge because they align with the basic ways that people interact with their surroundings. As societies grow more complex, these patterns become embedded in larger systems. A method that once applied to a small group becomes part of a broader set of rules. A routine that once served a local purpose becomes part of a cultural identity. People living in these later societies rarely trace these patterns to earlier generations, not because they lack curiosity, but because the distance is too great. The deep time amnesia has removed the direct memories, leaving only the patterns themselves. This makes it difficult for people to see themselves in the long timeline of human development. They understand their own history through the evidence available to them, which often reflects only a fraction of what actually occurred. Without visible traces, they assume that complexity began recently. They imagine that earlier societies were simple through their entire existence. This assumption feels logical because the surviving evidence supports it. But the absence of evidence does not provide a complete picture. Some layers of the past are quiet not because nothing happened, but because the traces have become too faint to detect. People in later societies may walk across landscapes where earlier generations coordinated large efforts, unaware that they are following paths that were once shaped by different hands. They build settlements near resources without knowing that earlier groups chose the same locations for similar reasons. They gather at certain landmarks without recognizing that the same landmarks once guided gatherings long forgotten. The patterns align because the environment, the needs of the people, and the basic structure of human behaviour remain consistent across time. Even the formation of myths and explanations about the world can reflect echoes of earlier ideas. People naturally create stories to explain forces they cannot see. These stories evolve over generations, shaped by local conditions and cultural shifts. When an earlier society once created explanations for the world, those explanations influenced the next generations through fragments and impressions. Even if the details were lost, the underlying themes sometimes remain. The idea of cycles, the importance of the sky, the recognition of natural rhythms, or the existence of guiding forces are themes that reappear across many societies. These themes may have origins in the earlier society, carried forward unconsciously through generations who adapted them to new realities. The way people structure space within their settlements also carries echoes from long before. The decision to keep communal areas at the centre, to store food in specific locations, or to designate certain spots for gatherings reflects both practical needs and inherited patterns. Even groups who believe they have no connection to earlier societies may organise their spaces in ways that resemble those earlier settlements. Without visible ruins to guide them, they follow functional instincts that lead to similar outcomes. As societies become more advanced in technology or organisation, they often develop explanations for their own origins that overlook the possibility of deeper layers. They focus on what they can observe and measure. This focus allows them to construct accurate accounts of many events, but it does not fill the gaps created by deep time amnesia. Without evidence, they cannot reconstruct what happened in periods where the traces have faded. This limitation influences how they interpret their own development. They assume a linear progression because it fits the available data, even if the full story includes chapters that have vanished. Education becomes another force that shapes how people see themselves. Later societies teach their children the information that has survived, reinforcing certain narratives and interpretations. These narratives become the framework through which people understand human development. The missing chapters are invisible to them, so they construct their understanding from the fragments that remain. This does not mislead them intentionally. It reflects the natural constraints of a knowledge passed through many generations. Even when researchers examine ancient sites, they must interpret what they find based on the evidence available. If the evidence reflects only the final phases of an earlier society, their conclusions may overlook the complexity that preceded it. They may find simple tools and assume the society was simple throughout its entire existence. They may find sparse settlements and assume the population was consistently small. Without deeper layers preserved in recognizable forms, the interpretation remains incomplete. This incomplete picture continues shaping how future generations understand their place in the long timeline. Technology, as it develops in later societies, may appear to have no connection to anything that came before, but some technological ideas emerge from older habits that were passed down unconsciously. A simple method for binding materials might evolve into more complex techniques. A practice for tracking seasons may grow into early calendars. A method for shaping stones may eventually lead to more advanced forms of crafting. Each step feels like a new discovery, yet the roots may stretch into periods that no one remembers. This continuity across time reveals something meaningful about human behavior. Even when memory fades completely, the tendencies that guide human adaptation remain. People respond to similar environments with similar strategies. They solve comparable problems with comparable methods. They seek stability, cooperation, and meaning. These tendencies anchor their behavior even when the past is forgotten. When people look at their own reflection as a society, they may see traits that appear unique to them. But these traits often reflect patterns that have appeared before, shaped by the same forces that guided earlier societies. The reflection becomes clearer when viewed across long stretches of time. It shows that human behavior is influenced not only by the present, but by deep patterns that persist even when the societies that once expressed them have faded from physical memory. This reflection encourages a broader perspective. It suggests that the story of human development is not limited to the surviving evidence. It extends into deeper layers that have been lost through erosion, climate, and the natural processes that erase physical traces. It reminds people that the visible past is only part of the fuller narrative. The rest may lie hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the right conditions or discoveries to reveal faint hints of earlier chapters. When people begin noticing parallels between different societies across different periods, they often interpret these parallels as evidence of a universal human experience. They see similarities in how groups organize, how they respond to challenges, and how they seek meaning. These similarities help people understand that their present ways of living are connected to a larger pattern. Even if the details differ, the underlying structure often remains familiar. Understanding these patterns does not erase the deep time amnesia, but it helps interpret the faint clues that survive. It encourages people to consider that their present ways of life may have more in common with earlier societies than they realize. The reflection is not a perfect mirror. It is shaped by time, loss, and adaptation. But the shapes that remain allow people to imagine how earlier societies may have lived, how they may have adapted, and how their traces may have influenced later generations without anyone being aware of it. When people begin to wonder whether humanity could be the second version of something that happened long before recorded history, the idea often feels distant from anything familiar. It feels like something meant for imagination rather than daily life. Yet the possibility becomes more reasonable when you consider how easily entire societies can disappear from memory, how fragile evidence becomes over long stretches of time, and how rarely the physical world preserves anything for more than a brief moment in geological terms. If earlier societies could rise, unravel, and fade into silence, then the question becomes less about whether they existed and more about whether anything from those periods could survive long enough for us to detect clearly. People living today often feel as though they stand at the peak of human development. They look at their technology, cities, and global communication and see a level of complexity unmatched by anything they know from the past. But this perspective is shaped by a very narrow slice of time. It reflects what has survived, not the full range of what might have occurred. If earlier societies developed structures that relied on materials unable to withstand thousands of years, their achievements would leave almost no trace. Even if they developed advanced methods in certain areas, the physical evidence might not match what later generations expect to find, leading researchers to overlook or reinterpret it. This possibility becomes easier to imagine when you consider how much of recent human activity would vanish if viewed from far in the future. If modern structures were left unattended for long enough, they would erode, collapse, and eventually blend into the landscape. Concrete would weaken, metal would corrode, and plastics would fragment. After enough millennia, almost everything recognizable would be gone. Only a few scattered materials might remain, buried deep within future sediment. Anyone examining the Earth long after these materials have been scattered might struggle to connect them to a global civilization. In the same way, an earlier society could have developed its own paths of advancement, shaped by the resources, climate, and knowledge available to them. Their methods would likely differ from those used today, making them harder to detect. If they relied on techniques or materials that decayed quickly, the archaeological record would not preserve them. If their population was small, their impact on the landscape would be limited. If their structures were built in regions that later experienced heavy erosion, tectonic shifts, or significant climate change, the traces would be erased long before anyone could find them. As people consider the idea that humanity may not be the first complex society to emerge on Earth, they sometimes look for signs that might connect the present to a forgotten past. These signs are rarely clear. A shaped stone might resemble a tool, but without consistent patterns it becomes difficult to interpret. A buried layer of unusual sediment might reflect natural events rather than human activity. Without strong repeated evidence, researchers remain cautious. This caution is understandable because the absence of clear patterns makes the interpretation of ancient clues uncertain. Yet uncertainty does not rule out the possibility. It highlights the difficulty of identifying faint traces across deep stretches of time. If another society did exist long before the known civilizations, it would not need to match modern society in scale or technology for the question to be meaningful. It could have been smaller, limited to a few regions, or shaped by environmental conditions very different from today's. Its organization might have been more modest, relying on intricate knowledge of the land rather than large structures. If this knowledge focused on natural cycles, travel routes, or seasonal patterns, its traces would be invisible today. People often imagine advanced societies through the lens of modern technologies, but complexity can take many forms. A society can be advanced in its understanding of the environment, its coordination, or its problem-solving without leaving behind steel, concrete, or plastic. One reason the possibility feels unfamiliar is that most of recorded history spans only a few thousand years, a small fraction of human existence. People often think of ancient civilizations such as Mesopotamia, Egypt, or the Indus Valley as the beginning of complex society. Yet humans have existed far longer than these periods. The time in which humans could have formed earlier societies extends far beyond the limits of current written records. Even if earlier societies were smaller or more geographically limited, they could have existed during periods where the land looked different from today, the climate followed different patterns, and populations were shaped by environmental pressures long forgotten. Another factor is the way knowledge accumulates and disappears. If an earlier society developed methods or ideas that advanced their daily life, those innovations would require stable structures to be passed down. If those structures failed, the knowledge would fade. People living generations later might maintain certain habits without understanding their origins. Over long enough periods, these habits could disappear entirely, leaving no sign that they once supported a larger system. The idea that humanity today may be rediscovering patterns once developed by earlier societies becomes plausible when you consider how frequently similar solutions appear across different times and places. People often believe that their current achievements are unique. They argue that technology such as electricity, computing, or large-scale engineering has no precedent. Yet these innovations represent only one path among many possible. Earlier societies might have developed knowledge that does not resemble modern technology. They might have understood aspects of astronomy, agriculture, navigation, or resource management in ways that provided their own advantages. These methods might not leave behind the durable evidence that modern technologies do. Without physical traces, their achievements remain invisible. When you examine the natural world, it becomes clear that Earth is constantly reshaping itself. Coastlines change, rivers alter their paths, forests expand and retreat, entire landscapes disappear under layers of sediment. If a society developed along ancient coastlines now submerged, their remains would be hidden beneath the ocean. If they lived in regions that later became deserts, the shifting sand would bury any traces. If they built in areas affected by glacial cycles, ice movement would destroy their structures. Even large human-made features could vanish when exposed to these forces. If the Earth is capable of erasing entire mountain ranges over geological time, it can certainly erase traces of human activity. When people explore the idea of being the second attempt, they sometimes imagine the earlier attempt ending in sudden catastrophe. While dramatic events are possible, the more likely scenario mirrors the slow unravelling described earlier. Environmental pressures, shortages, internal conflict, or gradual loss of knowledge could cause an earlier society to weaken over generations. Eventually, what remained would be small groups with limited knowledge, living in ways that reflect only the simplest parts of the earlier culture. Future generations would see only the final stages of this decline, not the height of the society that preceded it. This pattern is consistent across known history. It could easily apply to even older societies. Some of the patterns seen in modern human societies could reflect deeper instincts that appeared long before recorded history. The tendency to gather in groups, divide tasks, create explanations for natural forces, and manage shared resources follows predictable paths. These behaviours may have first developed during periods much earlier than the societies we recognise. If earlier societies experienced similar pressures, they may have formed similar structures. When people today organise into communities or develop shared methods for solving problems, they may be echoing patterns that were established long before written memory began, even if those echoes are faint and unrecognised. Comparing modern human behaviour with the patterns found in the archaeological record, researchers sometimes note recurring themes. The rise and fall of societies often follow similar paths. A group gathers resources efficiently, grows, develops systems, experiences strain, adapts or fails to adapt, and eventually transforms or dissolves. These cycles repeat across different regions and periods, shaped by environmental and social conditions. If earlier societies followed these cycles as well, their final stages would resemble the beginning stages of later groups, making it difficult to distinguish between them. Without clear markers, the layers blend, hiding the earlier attempts within patterns that appear universal. In this sense, the idea of being the second attempt is not about replicating specific technologies, but about repeating trajectories shaped by the natural constraints of human behaviour. When people innovate, they do so within the limits of their environment and knowledge. When they organise, they do so according to patterns that support survival. These patterns may have guided earlier societies and continue guiding the present one. The differences lie not in the instincts, but in the materials, climates, and opportunities available. Modern human society relies on materials and technologies that leave behind more durable traces than many earlier forms of complexity. Steel, glass, and synthetic materials may survive longer than wood, fibre, or clay under certain conditions. But over tens of thousands of years, even these materials degrade. This means that future societies might misinterpret the traces left behind, just as today's researchers might misinterpret faint clues from earlier periods. Long after modern civilization disappears, only scattered remnants would remain. Without context, these remnants could be interpreted in many different ways. Thinking about the possibility of being the second attempt leads to questions about how knowledge is preserved and how history is understood. Modern society depends on written records, digital archives, and organised education to maintain continuity. But these systems are vulnerable. They rely on infrastructure that must be maintained continuously. If something disrupted this system long enough, much of the accumulated knowledge could disappear. Without written records, the next generations would have to rely on oral memory, which can sustain only a fraction of modern knowledge. Over time, this fraction would shrink even further. This possibility highlights how fragile human knowledge is when viewed across long spans of time. It also shows how easily gaps can form. If earlier societies relied on similar methods, then their accumulated knowledge could disappear just as quickly. Even if they achieve significant advancements, the absence of systems to preserve those advancements across thousands of years would ensure their disappearance. Modern society might be rediscovering ideas that earlier societies once understood but were unable to preserve. When people reflect on their position in the timeline of human existence, they often see themselves as the culmination of everything that came before. They imagine that earlier societies were steps leading to the present, but this perspective might overlook entire chapters that have vanished. If humanity is indeed the second attempt, or even the third or fourth, then the current moment is not a pinnacle, but another stage in a cycle. Understanding this cycle offers a broader perspective on the challenges faced today. It suggests that the pressures modern society experiences are not unique. They are part of a larger pattern that has appeared before. This perspective does not diminish the achievements of modern humans. It adds depth to them. It shows that human creativity and resilience extend across far more time than recorded history suggests. It also implies that the capacity for organisation and innovation may have emerged much earlier than commonly assumed. People alive today might carry instincts shaped by experiences of their distant ancestors, including ancestors whose societies left no visible record. Considering the possibility of earlier attempts also encourages a deeper humility about what is known and unknown. It acknowledges that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It recognises that the Earth's ability to erase physical traces is far greater than the human ability to preserve them. It invites the idea that human history may be more complex, longer, and more layered than the surviving traces reveal. When people think about what might remain after a society has risen, flourished, struggled, and eventually disappeared, they often imagine physical remnants, tools buried in soil, stones arranged in patterns, charcoal layers hidden beneath sediment. These traces can be important, but they are rarely the most lasting part of a vanished world. Physical remnants fade, break apart, or become unrecognisable. Landscapes shift. Soil layers bury what once stood in the open. Even materials that seem durable eventually surrender to time. What survives longest is not always the objects left behind, but the quiet influences that shape later societies without them realising it. These influences form a subtle lesson that remains long after memory has dissolved. Long after an earlier society faded, people living in later generations adapted to landscapes that had been shaped by countless cycles of change. They walked across ground that once supported organised communities, unaware of the history beneath their feet. When they found stones arranged in unusual formations, they interpreted them through the lens of their own culture. When they encountered soil layers that reflected older activity, they thought of natural processes instead of human patterns. Even though they lacked direct memory of the earlier society, they still inherited the world shaped partly by the actions of those who came before. This inheritance formed the foundation of the quiet lesson that persists after everything else has vanished. This lesson emerges from the understanding that societies, no matter how organized or complex, remain part of the larger environment that supports them. When an earlier society gradually unraveled, it was not because people lacked intelligence or intention. It was because the systems they built were vulnerable to pressures that grew slowly and quietly. Environmental shifts, resource limitations, internal disagreements, and the loss of shared knowledge all contributed to the changes that eventually weakened them. These pressures continue shaping societies in later times, suggesting that the conditions experienced by early groups still influence how future ones develop. People alive in later generations do not consciously sense this connection. They focus on the challenges of their own time. They adapt to their own environment. They make decisions based on the pressures they experience. Yet many of their responses follow patterns similar to those of earlier societies. They create systems that help them survive. They rely on cooperation. They establish rules. They develop explanations for natural events. Even when the contexts differ, the underlying behaviors reflect similar principles. These patterns reveal that the lessons of earlier societies may persist as tendencies rather than knowledge. Because the earlier society faded from memory, the lesson it leaves is not a warning delivered through stories or symbols. It is not a message carved in stone. It is something more subtle. It is a reflection found in how societies behave under pressure. It is a reminder embedded in patterns that emerge repeatedly across generations. The lesson becomes visible not through direct knowledge, but through the reflection of human nature across long stretches of time. This quiet influence becomes especially apparent when later societies begin forming structures similar to those of earlier ones. They create centers of gathering, systems for coordinating labor, and networks of communication that reflect their needs. These structures feel like natural steps in their development, but they also align with the tendencies that shaped earlier societies. If the earlier society experienced periods of growth, followed by periods of strain, later societies may follow similar paths. When they expand too quickly, they face pressures that require adaptation. When they rely heavily on specific resources, they become vulnerable to changes in availability. These patterns emerge not because of memory, but because of the consistent relationship between human behavior and the environment. The quiet lesson left behind suggests that complexity itself does not guarantee stability. Societies can achieve impressive coordination, develop intricate knowledge, and establish strong relationships with their surroundings. But these achievements do not make them immune to change. They must continually adjust to shifting conditions. When they fail to adapt, they experience strains similar to what earlier societies faced. This pattern becomes clear only when viewed from a long perspective. People living in the present rarely see themselves as part of this pattern because their focus remains on immediate concerns. As time moves forward, later societies may occasionally encounter clues, small, faint reminders that earlier groups once lived differently. These clues might appear in unexpected soil layers, in fragments uncovered by erosion, or in patterns visible only from a certain perspective. Without context, these clues raise questions. They spark curiosity. They reveal that something existed before, even if the details remain uncertain. These moments of curiosity hint at the quiet lesson, encouraging people to consider how much of human history remains unseen. Even when clues are discovered, interpretation becomes limited by the information available. Researchers can study layers of soil, analyze stone fragments, and examine buried structures. They can estimate dates and reconstruct certain environmental conditions, but they cannot access the full story. The earlier society remains mostly invisible because the systems that preserved knowledge have disappeared. In this absence, the quiet lesson grows stronger. It reveals how fragile human memory becomes when stretched across long periods. It shows that knowledge must be actively preserved to endure. People living in the present often view their own technological abilities as protection against forgetting. They rely on written records, digital archives, and global networks to store information. These systems feel secure, they appear resilient, but they depend on continuous maintenance. If maintenance stops, the records become vulnerable. A disruption lasting long enough could erase significant amounts of knowledge, just as happened in earlier societies. Understanding this vulnerability forms part of the quiet lesson left behind. It encourages an awareness that knowledge must be protected not only by recording it, but by ensuring that the system supporting it remains strong. This quiet lesson also reflects the importance of adaptability. The earlier society unravelled when its systems could no longer respond to changing conditions. When their methods became too rigid, they struggled to adjust. This pattern can be seen in many societies across history. When systems become too dependent on specific conditions, they risk failure when those conditions shift. Later societies face similar challenges. Their technologies, structures, and institutions require adaptability to endure. The lesson becomes visible when examining how quickly circumstances can change and how essential flexibility becomes in navigating those changes. Another part of the quiet lesson involves the relationship between population size and knowledge preservation. Larger populations can store more knowledge, distribute roles more effectively, and maintain complex systems. Smaller populations depend on fewer individuals to preserve essential skills. When population declines or fragments, knowledge becomes harder to maintain. This pattern influenced the earlier society when it dissolved into smaller groups. Later societies may experience similar pressures if they face disruptions that reduce population or communication. Recognizing this connection reveals how deeply knowledge depends on social structure. As the long cycles of human societies unfold, the environment remains a central influence. It shapes what materials are available, how food is gathered, and how people organize themselves. The earlier society responded to its environment through patterns that made sense for its conditions. Later societies respond in similar ways, even if the details differ. This continuity forms part of the quiet lesson. It shows that human behavior, when shaped by the land, follows certain natural paths. Changes in climate, resources, or geography affect societies across different eras in comparable ways. While much of the earlier society has vanished, the land still holds traces of the relationship between human groups and their surroundings. Later societies inherit this land, even if they do not recognize its history. As they adapt, they repeat certain behaviors. They settle near water, they build in sheltered areas, they follow migration patterns of animals. These choices feel practical, but they also reflect the same instincts that shaped earlier societies. The quiet lesson is embedded in these recurring decisions. This idea becomes clearer when people study patterns in human development. Across many regions and time periods, certain structures reappear. Shared spaces for gathering, areas designated for storage, routes used for travel. These designs emerge independently because they address similar needs. When researchers observe these similarities, they often attribute them to universal human behavior. While this is partly true, it also reflects how earlier societies shape the foundational tendencies that later ones follow. Even without memory, the echoes remain. The quiet lesson suggests that humans, across time, remain connected through shared challenges, instincts, and responses. Even when memory fails and evidence disappears, this connection persists. It forms the basis for understanding long-term human history in a broader context. The earlier society may be forgotten, but its influence remains in the tendencies that guide later societies. One of the most important aspects of this lesson involves the understanding that societies cannot fully predict their future. The earlier society likely believed that its structures were stable. It may have seen itself as enduring. Yet it faced pressures that slowly changed its course. Modern societies experience similar uncertainty. They plan, innovate, and adapt, but they cannot see the full path ahead. The quiet lesson encourages humility. It reminds people that even well-designed systems can encounter unexpected challenges. Another important idea embedded in this lesson involves the value of continuity. The earlier society lost its coherence when its systems weakened and its population fragmented. Knowledge that once seemed secure disappeared because there was no structure left to preserve it. Later societies recognized the importance of maintaining continuity through education, communication, and shared practices. Even if the details differ, the principle remains. Knowledge requires stability to survive. This connects to another part of the quiet lesson, which involves the significance of small choices. The unravelling of the earlier society did not occur because of a single event. It happened through countless small factors that accumulated over time. Slight shortages, minor disagreements, small interruptions in communication, and gradual changes in climate all contributed to the weakening of their structure. Modern societies face similar accumulation of small pressures. Recognizing their impact becomes essential for navigating long-term stability. As time continues, the quiet lesson becomes available to those willing to examine long patterns rather than short events. It appears in the repeated rise and transformation of societies. It appears in the ways people respond to environmental stress. It appears in the slow shifts that shape human behavior across generations. Even if the earlier society remains invisible, the lesson it left behind influences how people interpret these patterns. The lesson becomes clearer when people consider how much of human history remains unseen. The deep time amnesia that erased the earlier society's memory suggests that entire chapters of human existence can vanish. This disappearance challenges assumptions about what is known and what remains hidden. It encourages an awareness that human history might be longer, more complex and more layered than the surviving evidence indicates. The quiet lesson emerges through the recognition that what is visible represents only a small portion of what once happened. This awareness leads to another part of the lesson, the possibility that lessons learned in one era can influence another indirectly. Even when specific knowledge fades, general tendencies endure. Adaptation, cooperation, and resource management remain central aspects of human behavior. These tendencies are shaped by countless generations before, including those who lived in societies that left no clear records. The quiet lesson suggests that people living in the present are connected to these earlier experiences through shared instincts. Recognizing these connections offers a broader perspective on the challenges faced today. Modern societies may encounter pressures similar to those experienced by earlier groups. Environmental shifts, population growth, resource management, and the complexity of social systems remain relevant. Understanding the quiet lesson left behind can provide insight into how these pressures influence human development. It does not provide solutions, but it encourages awareness that complexity and vulnerability exist together. In periods where people examine their past for guidance, they often look to the civilizations whose records remain intact. They study their successes and failures. They interpret their artifacts and written accounts. Yet the quiet lesson reminds them that there may be older influences beneath these layers. These influences are not stored in objects or stories. They exist in the rhythms of human society, reflected in the choices people make without realizing their origins. Over long enough periods, this quiet lesson becomes a constant presence, shaping how societies grow and adapt even when the earlier society is entirely forgotten. It is the lesson that complexity requires balance. It is the lesson that stability demands adaptability. It is the lesson that knowledge must be preserved intentionally. It is the lesson that societies exist within an environment that influences them more than they often realize. Even though later societies cannot recover the full story of what happened before, they still navigate the present with instincts shaped by countless generations. These instincts are the deep remnants of earlier societies, carried forward in ways that remain subtle but persistent. The quiet lesson left behind guides people not through memory, but through the patterns that continue repeating across time.